A History of Central Banking and the Enslavement of Mankind by Stephen Mitford Goodson. Chapter 1. How Usury Destroyed the Roman Empire. Money, being naturally barren, to make it breed money is preposterous and a perversion from the end of its institution, which was only to serve the purpose of exchange and not of increase. Men called bankers we shall hate, for they enrich themselves while doing nothing. Aristotle, Politics. The monetary systems of the Roman era, 753 BC to 565 AD, may be divided into three distinct periods where units of three different metals were used as the means of exchanging goods and services. Although there is evidence of modern human occupation, Homo sapiens sapiens, in the Rome area going back 14,000 years, with Neanderthals having lived there approximately 140,000 years ago, Rome as a city is traditionally said to have been founded by Romulus and Remus in 753 BC in a region surrounding the Palatine Hills, also known as Latium. According to the legend, Romulus, who killed his brother Remus, became its first king, but later shared the throne with Titus Tatius, the ruler of the Sabines. Around 600 BC, Latium came under the control of the Etruscans. This lasted until the last king, Tarquin the Proud, was expelled in 509 BC and the Roman Republic was established. The Etruscans, a people of Aryan origin, created one of the most advanced civilizations of that period and built roads, temples, and numerous public buildings in Rome. The first money used in Rome was the cow. This was not true money, but a barter system. Many early peoples used cattle as a medium of exchange. According to the legend of Heracles in the Aegean stables, the cattle kept there, over 3,000 in number, represented the treasury of King Aegeus. The Copper Age, 753 to 267 BC. As time went on, the Romans took to using, instead of cattle, irregular lumps of copper or bronze. These lumps were called ius rude, rough metal, and had to be weighed for each transaction. There was an increase in trade and Rome became one of the most prosperous cities in the ancient world. This prosperity was based on uncoined copper, later bronze, metal which was measured by weight according to a fixed system of units. It was issued by the Roman treasury in the form of ingots weighing 3.5 pounds, 1.6 kilograms, with the full backing of the state and was known as ius signatum, stamped metal, because it was stamped by the government with a cow, eagle, or elephant or other image. Sometimes they were made to resemble a scallop shell. In 289 BC, these ingots were replaced by discoidal, cast-leaded bronze coins, ius grave, heavy metal. They represented national money and were paid into circulation by the state, and each was only of value inasmuch as the symbols on which its numbers were recorded were scarce or otherwise. This money was thus based on law rather than the metallic content, although that content was standardized and the coin did have some intrinsic value, unlike most coins today. This can be considered as an early example of the successful use of fiat money. While fiat money is much criticized in some quarters, for example by the followers of Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises, there is nothing wrong with it as long as it is issued by government, not by private bankers, and is carefully protected against counterfeiters. Non-fiat money, in contrast, has the serious drawback that whoever sets the prices of gold and silver, i.e. private bankers, can control the nation's economy. Up to 300 BC, there was an unsurpassed increase in public and private wealth of the Romans. This may be measured in the gain of land. After the conclusion of the Second Latin War in 338 BC and the defeat of the Etruscans, the Roman Republic increased in size from 2,135 square miles, 5,525 square kilometers, to 10,350 square miles, 26,805 square kilometers, or 20% of peninsular Italy. In tandem with the expansion of its land area, the population rose from about 750,000 to 1 million, with 150,000 persons living in Rome itself. A partnership was formed between the Senate and the people known as Senatus Populusque Romanus, SPQR, the Senate and people of Rome. The political leaders were renowned for their frugality and honest virtue. The means of exchange was strictly regulated in accordance with the increase in population and trade, and there was zero inflation. Debt bondage nexum, whereby a free man offered his services as security for a loan plus interest, and where in cases of non-payment the debt had to be worked off, was abolished after plebeian agitation by the Lex Potelia in 326 BC. The Silver Age, 267 to 27 BC. The traditional money system was destroyed in 267 BC when the patrician elite attained the privilege to mint silver coinage. This change was typified by a patrician who went to the temple of Juno Moneta, from which the word money is derived, and converted a sack full of silver denarii to 5 times its original value by the simple expedient of stamping a new value on the coins. He thus pocketed a very substantial difference in seigniorage for his own private account. The early Roman silver coin was known as the drachma, and was modeled on a coin used in the Greek south of the peninsula. It was later replaced with the smaller and lighter denarius. There was also a half denarius, called the quinarius, and a quarter unit, called the sestertius. Still later, the system was supplemented with the victoriatus, somewhat lighter than the denarius and probably intended to facilitate trade with Rome's Greek neighbors. There were very few deposits of silver in the Italian peninsula, and as a consequence the Roman army had to be expanded in order to conquer territories to obtain supplies. The Roman peasants, who had provided the Republic with food independence, were drafted in increasing numbers into the army. Agricultural production, especially corn, declined, and the peasant farms were replaced by latifundia, which were large estates worked by slaves. Wheat also had to be imported from North Africa. Tensions about granting citizenship and enfranchisement between Rome and her Italic allies resulted in the Social War from 90 to 89 BC. This lack of enfranchisement had led to the fragmentation of Roman society and the alienation of the working-class citizens, who were treated as chattel and who had no responsibilities and therefore no commitment towards the state. Until as late as the Second Punic War, from 218 to 201 BC, they were not allowed to serve in the army. This was a classic example of a society which had been monetarized. The Republic was weakened and there was increasing despotism. Piracy became a major problem, with raids taking place on the coast, villas being sacked, and travelers kidnapped. Violence became endemic and gangsters and terrorists were active in Rome, as there was no police force to maintain law and order. These are inevitable consequences of a society in which money had become the highest ethos. There was also political intrigue amongst the elite. Economic deprivation caused discontent amongst the poor, who were increasingly slaves from North Africa, and social unrest. This turmoil culminated in the revolt led by Spartacus in 73 to 71 BC. The first and second revolts were in 135 to 132 BC and in 104 to 100 BC. The Jewish role in the collapse. The first known Jews who arrived in Rome in 161 BC were Yehuda and Maccabee. These early Roman Jews employed themselves as craftsmen, peddlers, and shopkeepers. In the last occupation, they also indulged in money lending. As a community, they lived separately in apartments. They governed themselves according to their own laws and were exempt from military service. In 139 BC, the Jews, who were not Roman citizens, were expelled by Praetor Hispanus for proselytizing, but they soon returned. In 19 AD, by means of a senatus consultum, Emperor Tiberius expelled 4,000 Jews, who had been involved in various scandals, but none of these expulsions was properly enforced, and their continued presence, in particular as usurers, would play a significant role in the decline and collapse of the Roman Empire. Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar, 100 to 44 BC, was born into an aristocratic family on July 12, 100 BC. He was tall and fair-headed and practiced briefly as a lawyer before becoming a brilliant military commander who conquered Gaul, France, in 59 to 52 BC. After his defeat of Pompey the Great in 48 BC at Pharsalus, Caesar became the undisputed leader of the Roman Republic. On his return to Italy in September 45 BC, Caesar found the streets and cities crowded with homeless people who had been forced off the land by usurers and land monopolists. 300,000 people had to be fed daily at the public granary. Usury was flourishing with disastrous consequences. The principal usurers, many of whom were Jewish, were charging interest rates as high as 48% per annum. As Lucius Annaeus Seneca, 4 BC to 65 AD, the philosopher, would later remark in De Superstitione, the customs of that most criminal nation have gained such strength that they have now been received in all lands. The conquered have given laws to the conqueror. At that time there were two main political parties, the optimates, centered around the nobility, the Senate and the privileged few, and the populares, who represented the citizens. Caesar immediately assumed leadership of the latter. Caesar fully understood the evils of usury and how to counter them. He recognized the profound truth that money is a national agent, created by law for a national purpose, and that no classes of men should withhold it from circulation so as to cause panics, in order that speculators could advance the rates of interest, or could buy up property at ruinous prices after such panic. Caesar introduced the following social reforms. 1. Restoration of property was done at the much lower valuations which held prior to the Civil War, 49 to 45 BC. 2. Several remissions of rents were granted. 3. Large numbers of poor citizens and discharged veterans were settled on allotments. 4. Free housing was provided to 80,000 impoverished families. 5. Soldiers' pay was increased from 123 to 225 denarii. 6. The corn dole was regulated. 7. Provincial communities were enfranchised. 8. Confusion in the calendar was removed by fixing it at 365 and 1/4 days from 1st of January 44 BC. His monetary reforms were as follows. 1. State debt levels were immediately reduced by 25%. 2. Control of the mint was transferred from the patricians, usurers, to government. 3. Cheap metal coins were issued as the means of exchange. 4. It was ruled that interest could not be levied at more than 1% per month. 5. It was decreed that interest could not be charged on interest, and that the total interest charge could never exceed the capital loaned, the in duplum rule. 6. Slavery was abolished as a means of settling debt. 7. Aristocrats were forced to employ their capital and not hoard it. These measures enraged the aristocrats and plutocrats whose livelihood was now severely restricted. They therefore conspired to murder Caesar, the hero of the people. On that fateful morning of the 15th of March, 44 BC, only 4 years after assuming power, he arrived at the Senate building unarmed, having dismissed his military guard, who had previously been in constant attendance. Surrounded by 60 conspirators, he was stabbed to death and received 23 wounds. The Gold Age, 27 BC to 476 AD. In 27 BC, shortly after Caesar's death and his deification, the Romans adopted the gold standard, which would have far-reaching implications for the financial stability of the empire and lead directly to its demise. Previously, during the days of the Roman Republic, gold coins were issued only in times of great need, such as during the Second Punic War or the campaign of Lucius Cornelius Sulla. There were very few gold mines in Europe, except in remote places like Wales, Transylvania, and Spain, and therefore most of the supplies could only be secured from the east. This in turn required a large and expensive army, which became engaged in constant conflict at the empire's fringes. The gold coin was known as an aureus. Also in circulation were the silver denarius and the copper coins, the sestertius, dupondius, and the as. The scarcity of gold or commodity money frequently induced periods of deflation as a result of the lack of a circulating means of exchange. In 13 BC, a measure of relief was provided when the weight of the gold aureus was reduced from 122 to 72 grains, and this remained the standard weight until 310 AD. However, metals continued to flow eastwards in order to pay for luxury items, religious dues, and usury payments. Furthermore, wear and tear resulted in the loss of 1/3 of total coinage in circulation over a 100-year period. As gold was treated as a commodity, its debasement was not tolerated. Emperor Constantine, 275 to 337 AD, personally ordered death for counterfeiting and the burning of public minters who committed falsification. Money changers who did not report a counterfeit gold bezant, solidus, were immediately flogged, enslaved, and exiled. These regulations were effective for the bezant, which weighed 70 grains and was slightly more than the bezant which was still circulating in 1025 AD and weighed 68 grains. In 313 AD, Christianity was tolerated by the Edict of Milan, and from 380 AD was established as the official religion by Emperor Theodosius I, from 347 to 395 AD. From this time, monetary power resided in the religious authority of the Pontifex Maximus. A feature of the imperial era was social injustice and the undermining of the middle classes through excessive taxation. The Roman businessman was not a trader, but a looter of the provinces, as the homeland had a weak industrial production base, which was incapable of providing the required manufactured goods. As the monetarization of society continued, with the rich parasitizing the common man, the plebeians became more like slaves. The abolition of the jury system was symptomatic of the declining respect and importance for the common man in Roman society. Role of the church in the decline and fall. The tax that Emperor Constantine decreed, viz., that 1/10 of all income had to be tithed to the Christian church, hastens the destruction of the empire. Eventually, the church held 1/3 to 1/2 of all lands and accumulated wealth. This concentration of wealth produced a great scarcity of coinage. Money existed, but there was no circulation or distribution of goods and services. Instead of recycling the tithed money by means of investment in the community or charitable works such as construction of hospitals, schools, and libraries, vast hoards of gold were concentrated behind the 20-foot, 6.1 meter, thick walls of the fortress city of Constantinople and the Vatican fortress in Rome. In its last years in the 5th and 6th centuries, the Roman Empire had become a parasitic organism, subject to alternating phases of inflation and deflation. Its economic ruination preceded its political ruination. There was no industrial production, almost all food had to be imported, and usury was practiced on an unprecedented scale. The wealth of the empire that was not held by the church was controlled by 2,000 Roman families. The rest of the population lived in poverty. Consequences. The implosion of the western half of the empire in 476 AD, after repeated military incursions by the Goths and Vandals, resulted in the Dark Ages. A punishing multi-century deflationary depression followed. According to the United States Silver Commission of 1876, the metallic money of the Roman Empire at its height amounted to $1.8 billion, but by the end of the Dark Ages, it had shrunk to $200 million. Agriculture was reduced to subsistence level. Large sailing vessels vanished as there was no trade. Commerce stagnated. Arts and sciences were lost, and the knowledge of cement making disappeared. Major factors in the decline of the Roman Empire were the concentration of wealth, the absence of mining deposits for industrial production, and the vast importation of non-white slaves with the resultant degradation of the genetic value of the nation. By the 4th century AD, as a result of the continuing decline in Roman female fertility, slaves outnumbered citizens by 5 to 1. The most important economic reason was an inadequate supply of an inexpensive circulating medium of money and the false notion that money should be a commodity. Thus, from an economic perspective, the lessons from the fall of Rome are that a dishonest economic system will inevitably contribute to the forces of dissolution. No society can survive a false economic system. For any society to function and prosper, it is absolutely fundamental that the means of exchange be issued free of debt and interest by the legal authority of the state as representatives of the people in perpetuity. A History of Central Banking and the Enslavement of Mankind by Stephen Mitford Goodson. Chapter 2. The Hidden Origins of the Bank of England. All great events have been distorted, most of the important causes concealed. If the history of England is ever written by one who has the knowledge and the courage, the world would be astonished. Benjamin Disraeli, Prime Minister of Great Britain. Ancient England. King Offa ruled the kingdom of Mercia, which was bounded by the rivers Trent and Mersey in the north, the Thames Valley in the south, Wales in the west, and East Anglia and Essex in the east, from 757 to 791 AD. It was one of the 7 autonomous kingdoms of the Anglo-Saxon Heptarchy. Offa was a wise and able administrator and a kind-hearted leader. He established the first monetary system in England. On account of the scarcity of gold, he used silver for coinage and as a store of wealth. The standard unit of exchange was a pound of silver divided into 240 pennies. The pennies were stamped with a star, Old English stara, from which the word sterling is derived. In 787, King Offa introduced a statute prohibiting usury, viz., the charging of interest on money lent, a concept which dates back to the pagan era. The laws against usury were further entrenched by King Alfred, 865 to 899, who directed that the property of usurers be forfeited, while in 1050, Edward the Confessor, 1042 to 1066, decreed not only forfeiture, but that a usurer be declared an outlaw and be banished for life. First Jewish migration and expulsion. The Jews first arrived in England in 1066 in the wake of William I's defeat of King Harold II at Hastings on the 14th of October. These Jews came from Rouen, 75 miles, 121 kilometers, from Falaise in Normandy, where William the Conqueror was born illegitimately as William the Bastard. Although the historical record does not indicate whether they promoted the idea of a military invasion of England, these Jews had at the very least financed it. For this support they were richly rewarded by being allowed to practice usury under royal protection. The consequences for the English people were disastrous. By charging rates of interest of 33% per annum on lands mortgaged by nobles and 300% per annum on tools of trade or chattels pledged by workmen, within 2 generations, 1/4 of all English lands were in the hands of Jewish usurers. At his death in 1186, Aaron of Lincoln was declared to be the richest man in England, and it was estimated that his wealth exceeded that of King Henry II. Furthermore, the Jewish immigrants undermined the ethos of the guilds and exasperated the English merchants by selling a large variety of goods under one roof. They also played a prominent role in the clipping of silver coins and the melting of them into bullion and the plating of tin with silver. The famous economist, Dr. William Cunningham, compares the activity of the Jews in England from the 11th century onward to a sponge, which sucks up all the wealth of the land and thereby hinders all economic development. Interesting, too, is the proof that even at this early period the government did everything in its power to make the Jews take up decent trades and honest work, and thereby, at the same time, amalgamate with the rest of the population, but all to no purpose. By the beginning of the 13th century, many nobles were in danger of losing their lands through usury and taxation. In 1207, an enormous sum of £60,000 was levied in taxes on the Christian population. The Jews also paid tax, but at a lower rate and on grossly understated income and wealth. Nobles who borrowed from Jewish moneylenders and from the king and his agents had to have their mortgages registered on the treasury rolls. As soon as a noble got into financial difficulty, the king would buy the debt from the moneylender and seize the land for himself. King John, 1199 to 1216, was utterly reckless in pursuit of this depraved and dishonest policy, and was moreover profligate, incompetent, and utterly beholden to his Jews. In 1215, the nobles revolted and forced King John to sign the Magna Carta on the 15th of June, 1215. This document consists of 61 clauses relating to the establishment of various constitutional and legal rights, but its principal purpose was to cancel the bonds of the Jewish moneylenders and to abolish usury and the privileged position of the Jews. On the 19th of October 1216, King John died and was succeeded by his 9-year-old son Henry III, who ruled from 1219 to 1272. His reign was little better than that of his father, and 19 of the clauses affecting the Jews were abrogated the following year. However, his heir, Edward I, from 1272 to 1307, soon realized that Jews had no place in English society, and that if he did not take action, he would be in danger of losing his throne. In 1233 and 1275, statutes of Jewry were passed which abolished all forms of usury. As many of these Jews could no longer earn a living, a statute was passed by King Edward on the 18th of July 1290, compelling the entire Jewish population of 16,511 to leave England forever, one of over 100 expulsions which have been recorded throughout European history. The announcement was greeted with great joy and jubilation throughout the land. Unlike the modern practice of ethnic cleansing, the Jews, after paying a tax of 1/15 of the value of their movables and 1/10 of their specie, were permitted to leave with all their goods and chattels. Any Jew who remained after the 1st of November 1290, All Saints' Day, was liable to be executed. The glorious Middle Ages. With the banishment of the moneylenders and the abolition of usury, taxes were moderate and there was no state debt, as the interest-free tally stick was used for government expenditures. This ancient instrument of finance, known to the Saracens, and possibly also to the Chinese, is derived from the Latin word talia, meaning a stick. A tally stick was made out of hazel, willow, or boxwood, because these woods split easily. They were usually 8 inches in length, 20.3 centimeters, from forefinger to thumb, and half an inch, 1.3 centimeters wide, although they could be up to 8 feet, 2.44 meters long. The denominations were indicated by different sized cuts in the wood. 1,000 pounds were marked by cutting out the thickness of the palm of a hand, 100 pounds by the breadth of the little finger, 1 pound that of a swelling barley corn, shillings somewhat less, and pence were marked by incisions. The payee was recorded on the flat sides. When all the details had been recorded on the tally, it was split nearly to the bottom so that one part retained a stump or handle on which a hole could be bored. This was known as the counter-tally or counterfoil and was held on a rod at the exchequer. The flat strip, without the stump, was given to the payee. As no two pieces of wood are identical, it was impossible to forge a tally stick. Tally sticks were first introduced during the reign of King Henry II from 1100 to 35 AD, and would remain in circulation until 1783. It was, however, during the period of 1290 to 1485 that tallies would reach their apogee and constitute the principal means of state finance. Tallies were used not only to pay state salaries, but to finance major items of infrastructure, such as construction of the Wall of the City of London, and public buildings and ports. The exact amount of tallies in circulation is not known, but as late as 1694, 17 million pounds worth were still in existence. This was a prodigious sum, as the king's annual budget rarely exceeded 2.5 million pounds, and a laborer earned a penny a day. With tolerable taxes, no state debt, and no interest to pay, England enjoyed a period of unparalleled growth and prosperity. The average laborer worked only 14 weeks and enjoyed 160 to 180 holidays. According to Lord William Leverhulme, a writer of that time, the men of the 15th century were very well paid. In fact, so well paid that the purchasing power of their wages and their standard of living would only be exceeded in the late 19th century. A laborer could provide for all the necessities his family required. They were well clothed in good wool and cloth and had plenty of meat and bread. Houston Stewart Chamberlain, the Anglo-German philosopher, confirms these living conditions in his The Foundations of the 19th Century. In the 13th century, when the Teutonic races began to build their new world, the agriculturalist over nearly the whole of Europe was a freer man, with a more assured existence than he is today. Copyhold was the rule, so that England, for example, today a seat of landlordism, was even in the 15th century almost entirely in the hands of thousands of farmers, who were not only legal owners of their land, but possessed in addition far-reaching free rights to common pastures and woodlands. During their spare hours, many craftsmen volunteered their skills in building some of England's magnificent cathedrals, which reinforces one of the basic tenets of Western civilization that, without leisure time, the fostering of culture is not possible. George Macaulay Trevelyan, the English social historian, describes these accomplishments as follows. The continuous but ever-moving tradition of ecclesiastical architecture still proceeded on its majestic way, filling England with towering forests of masonry of which the beauty and grandeur have never been rivaled either by the ancients or the moderns. In the newer churches, the light no longer crept but flooded in, through the stained glass, of which the secret is today even more completely lost than the magic of the architecture. Although King Henry VIII, 1509 to 1547, relaxed the laws regarding usury in 1509, They were subsequently repealed by his son, King Edward VI, 1547-1553, by an act of 1552, whose preamble stated that usury is by word of God utterly prohibited as a vice most odious and detestable. End of a golden era. During the 17th century, this golden era came to a tragic end. Large numbers of Jews, who had been expelled from Spain in 1492 by Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon on account of their persistent involvement in usury and unethical business practices, had settled in Holland. Although the Dutch were at that time an important maritime power, the Jewish usurers based in Amsterdam desired to return to England, where their prospects for expanding the operations of their money-lending empire were far more promising. During the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, 1558-1603, small numbers of Marranos, Spanish Jews who had converted to a sham form of Christianity, settled in London. Many of them practiced as goldsmiths, accepting deposits of gold for safekeeping, and then issuing 10 times the amount of gold received as gold receipts, that is, loans with interest. These receipts, a forerunner of the fraudulent fractional reserve system of banking, were initially lent to the Crown or Treasury at 8% per annum, but according to Samuel Pepys, the diarist and secretary to the Admiralty, the interest rate increased to as much as 20% and even 30% per annum. The rate of interest merchants paid often exceeded 33% per annum, even though the legal rate was only 6% per annum. Workmen and poor people bore the brunt of these extortionate rates of interest by having to pay 60%, 70%, or even 80% per annum. According to Michael Godfrey, the author of a pamphlet entitled A Short Account of the Bank of England, 2 to 3 million pounds had been lost through the bankruptcies of goldsmiths and the disappearance of their clerks. Cromwell in the English Civil War. In 1534, by the Act of Supremacy, the Church of England was established as the official religion of England by King Henry VIII. During the 16th and 17th centuries, Puritan beliefs based on the teachings of John Wycliffe and John Calvin gained an increasing number of adherents. The Puritans considered the Bible to be the true law of God and emphasized Bible reading, prayer, and preaching, and the simplification of the ritual of the sacraments. The Stuart King Charles I, 1625-1649, who wished to maintain the preeminence of the Anglican Church, came into intensified conflict with the Puritans, who were making great progress in proselytizing the population. After the assassination of Charles's trusted friend and advisor, the Duke of Buckingham in 1628, he gradually became more isolated. The growing religious division provided a perfect opportunity for exploitation by the Jewish conspirators. As Isaac Disraeli, the father of Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, wrote in The Life and Reign of Charles I, the nation was artfully divided into Sabbatarians and Sabbath breakers. In 1640, one of the leaders of the clandestine Jewish community, Fernandez Carvajal, a merchant and spy, who was also known as the Great Jew, organized an armed militia of about 10,000 operatives, who were used to intimidate the people of London and sow confusion. Large numbers of pamphlets and leaflets were also distributed. Civil war soon followed between the Royalists, Anglicans, and the Roundheads, Puritans, and lasted from 1642 to 1648. The Roundheads, with their New Model Army, were victorious, and an estimated 190,000 persons, or 3.8% of the population, died. The leader of the Roundheads was Oliver Cromwell, 1599 to 1658, whose New Model Army was not only outfitted and provisioned by the chief contractor and professional agitator Fernandez Carvajal, but also bankrolled by Jewish moneylenders in Amsterdam. The leader of the Dutch Jews, Manasseh ben Israel, sent begging petitions to Cromwell asking that the Jews be allowed to immigrate to England in return for the financial favors which he had so generously arranged. The regicide of King Charles I. The treachery to which Cromwell descended is revealed in correspondence between himself and the Synagogue of Molheim, Germany, 16th of June 1647, from O.C. Oliver Cromwell to Ebenezer Pratt. In return for financial support, Will advocated admission of Jews to England. This, however, impossible while Charles living. Charles cannot be executed without trial, adequate grounds for which do not at present exist. Therefore, advised that Charles be assassinated, but will have nothing to do with arrangements for procuring an assassin, though willing to help in his escape. In reply was dispatched the following: 12th of July, 1647, to O.C. from Ebenezer Pratt. Will grant financial aid as soon as Charles removed and Jews admitted. Assassination too dangerous. Charles will be given an opportunity to escape. His recapture will make trial and execution possible. The support will be liberal, but useless to discuss terms until trial commences. King Charles was staying as a virtual prisoner in Holmby House, Northamptonshire. On the 4th of June, 1647, 500 revolutionaries seized the king, but then allowed him to escape to the Isle of Wight, where he was subsequently arrested. On the 5th of September, 1648, the House of Commons decided that the king's concessions were satisfactory to a settlement. Cromwell then purged the House of Commons with the assistance of Colonel Pride until there was only a rump of 50 members left, who then duly voted that the king be put on trial. Not a single English lawyer was prepared to draw up a charge sheet against the king. Eventually, it was provided by a Dutch Jew, Isaac Dorislaus. The king was forced to participate in a show trial in a high court of justice in which 2/3 of its members were levelers from the army. Charles refused to plead, but was found guilty and executed on the 30th of January 1649. As the procession approached the scaffold, large numbers of the crowd shouted, "God save the king!" After the deed had been done, there was an enormous groan of anguish. Second Jewish migration. From the 7th to the 18th of December 1655, Cromwell, who was called the Protector, held a conference in Whitehall, London, in order to obtain approval for the large-scale immigration of Jews. In spite of the conference being packed with Cromwell supporters, the overwhelming consensus of the delegates, who were mainly priests, lawyers, and merchants, was that the Jews should not be permitted to enter England. In October 1656, the first Jews were surreptitiously allowed to land freely in England, in spite of strong protests having been lodged by the subcommittee of the Council of State, who declared that these Jews would be a grave menace to the state and the Christian religion. The merchants, without exception, spoke against the admission of the Jews. They declared that the proposed immigrants would be morally harmful to the state and that their admission would enrich foreigners at the expense of the English. Cromwell died on the 3rd of September 1658 and was succeeded by his son, Richard, who ruled for 9 months. Charles I's son, Charles II, 1660 to 1685, succeeded his executed father. Although he would be the last English monarch to issue money, banknotes, in his own right, he made 2 fatal errors of governance. On the 1st of August 1663, he passed the euphemistically sounding Act for the Encouragement of Trade, which enabled the export of all foreign coins or bullion or gold or silver, free of interdict, regulation, or duties of any kind. During the debate on the bill, the Earl of Anglesey presciently observed that "it is dangerous to the peace of the kingdom when it shall be in the power of half a dozen or half a score of rich, discontented, or factious persons to make a bank and accumulation of our own coin and bullion beyond the seas and leave us in want of money when it shall not, no longer, be in the king's power to prevent it." 3 years later, by means of an Act for the Encouragement of Coinage, he permitted private persons, i.e. bankers and goldsmiths, to mint the coins of the realm at the royal mint and thereby acquire the considerable benefits of the seigniorage, the difference between the face value of coins and their production costs, income for their own private account. Furthermore, it enabled them to increase or diminish the supply of money in circulation and to raise or lower prices at will to the great detriment of the general population. His brother, James II, 1685 to 1688, reign only lasted 3 years. He was a victim of unscrupulous pamphleteering and propaganda, which emanated mainly from Holland. A military expedition undertaken by Prince William of Orange eventually dethroned him. Although James's army was numerically superior, he was discouraged from attacking after John Churchill, 1st Duke of Marlborough, suddenly deserted him. According to the Jewish Encyclopedia, Churchill subsequently received an annual stipend of £6,000 from the Dutch Jew Solomon de Medina in payment for his treasonous conduct. These vast sums of blood money enabled Churchill to proceed with the construction of Blenheim Palace, which was completed at his death in 1722. William of Orange's military campaign, like that of the other William the Conqueror in 1066, was financed by Jewish bankers. In return for their support, William III, 1689 to 1702, would surrender the royal prerogative of issuing England's money free of debt and interest to a consortium known as the Governor and Company of the Bank of England. A. N. Field, in All These Things, summarizes these epical events known as the Glorious Revolution of 1688, but which was in effect the infamous revolution, as follows. 33 years after Cromwell had let the Jews into Britain, a Dutch prince arrived from Amsterdam surrounded by a whole swarm of Jews from that financial center. Driving his royal father-in-law, James II, out of the kingdom, he graciously consented to ascend the throne of Britain. A very natural result following on this event was the inauguration of the national debt by the establishment 6 years later of the Bank of England for the purpose of lending money to the crown. Britain had paid her way as she went until the Jews arrived. The pawnshop was then opened, and the resulting situation in which the nation finds itself today could not be better described than in the words put by Shakespeare with prophetic vision in the mouth of the dying John of Gaunt. This land of such dear souls, this dear, dear land, dear for her reputation through the world, is now leased out, I die pronouncing it, like to a tenement or pelting farm. England, bound in with the triumphant sea, whose rocky shore beats back the envious siege of watery Neptune, is now bound in with shame, with inky blots and rotten parchment bonds. That England, that was wont to conquer others, hath made a shameful conquest of itself. Richard II, Act 2, Scene 1. The history of the second Jewish settlement in Britain is one long trail of parchment bonds shackling the nation in debt. Every step of the ascent of the Jew in the nation's affairs has been marked by the increase and multiplication of debt. Establishment of the Bank of England. The need for a privately owned central bank was fronted by a retired pirate, William Paterson, when he wrote a pamphlet in 1693 entitled A Brief Account of the Intended Bank of England. He would later boast that this bank hath the benefit of interest on all moneys which it creates out of nothing. On Thursday, the 21st of June 1694, subscription lists for the bank, which had a capital of £1.2 million, were opened. By the following Monday, this amount had been fully subscribed. The ostensible purpose of the bank was to lend King William unlimited sums at 8% per annum to enable the prosecution of war, and in particular, the conflict against Louis XIV of France, whose country was not on the usury system. The bank would thus receive from the Crown interest of £100,000 per annum, the additional £4,000 being an administrative fee. The bank also acquired the right to issue £1.2 million in banknotes without any gold cover. Prior to its listing, the bylaws of the bank were carefully scrutinized by Sergeant-at-Law Cresswell Levins in order to ensure that the bank complied with its hidden purpose, viz., to fleece the English people in perpetuity by allowing the creation of the nation's money and means of exchange out of nothing at interest. All of this fake money was to be accompanied by compounding interest. Levins was a crypto-Jew, or Marrano, who practiced as an advocate and later served as a judge. There was much opposition to the establishment of the bank. Foremost were the goldsmiths and moneylenders, who correctly foresaw that it would bring an end to their usurious racket of fractional reserve banking based on their gold receipts. Landowners and country gentry feared an escalation in interest rates, as the bank would control the nation's money supply. There were allegations that the bank would favor certain merchants with low rates of interest. The biggest fear was that the bank would grow too powerful and would become the keystone of the commercial world. Unfortunately, this is exactly what happened, as the Bank of England became the model on which all subsequent central banks were replicated. At that time, the House of Commons had 514 members consisting of 243 Tories, 241 Whigs, and 28 members whose allegiance was unknown. About two-thirds of the members were country gentlemen, and it is believed that of the 514 members, approximately 20% were illiterate. The bill was debated in July 1694, the high point in summer, when most of the rural members were engaged in summer pursuits and the harvesting of their crops. On that fateful Friday, the 27th of July 1694, when the Charter of Incorporation was granted, only 42 members were present, all of them Whigs, as the Tories opposed the bill, who all voted in favor of it. This begs the question as to what a quorum consisted of in those days. The title of the bill made no mention of the proposed Bank of England, which is only described, or one might say, secreted, two-thirds down in the unintelligible verbiage, to the layman that is, of the bill. The opening sentence of the bill reads as follows: William and Mary, by the grace of God, King and Queen of England, Scotland, France, and Ireland, defenders of the faith, etc., to all for whom these presents shall come greeting. The third sentence, which contains 242 words, starts, Whereas in and by a certain act lately made in Parliament, entitled an act for granting to their Majesties several rates and duties upon tonnage of ships and vessels, and upon beer, ale, and other liquors, for securing certain recompenses and advantages in the said act mentioned, to such persons as shall voluntarily advance the sum of £1,500,000 toward carrying on the war with France, it is amongst other things enacted. The gist of the final two-thirds of the bill details the necessity to levy a complicated array of new rates, duties, and taxes on ships, beer, ale, and other liquors. The true purpose of these taxes was that they were needed in order to fund the interest on all future government loans. Shortly thereafter, further taxes were introduced, including a land tax, paper tax, poll tax, salt tax, stamp tax, and window tax, which replaced the hearth or chimney tax. Other taxes initiated were a tax on peddlers, a tax on hackney coaches, a tax on births, marriages, and deaths, and lastly, a tax on bachelors. However, the most punitive tax introduced was an income tax, levied at a rate of 20%. It was applied not only to companies, but laborers too. War and debt slavery in perpetuity. Henceforth, a pattern would emerge where unnecessary wars would be embarked upon which simultaneously increased the national debt and the profits of the usurers. Significantly, most of these wars were started against countries that had implemented interest-free state banking systems, as was the case in the North American colonies and France under Napoleon. This pattern of attacking and enforcing the bankers' system of usury had been deployed widely in the modern era and includes the defeats of Imperial Russia in World War I, Germany, Italy, and Japan in World War II, and most recently, Libya in 2011. These were all countries which had state banking systems, which distributed the wealth of their respective nations on an equitable basis and provided their populations with a standard of living far superior to that of their rivals and contemporaries. Within 2 years of its establishment in 1696, the Bank of England had £1.75 million worth of banknotes circulating with a gold reserve of only 2%, or £36,000. On the 1st of May 1707, the union between Scotland and England was established, motivated in no small way by the necessity to seize control of the Royal Mint in Edinburgh, which took place in 1709. In 1720, after the conclusion of the War of the Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714, the national debt had risen to £30 million, with the war itself having cost £50 million. After the American War of Independence, 1775 to 1783, which had been fought after the colonists had been forced to replace their debt and largely interest-free colonial scrip with English money and had resulted in 50% unemployment, the national debt soared to £176 million. According to Sir John Harold Clapham, who wrote The Bank of England, a History 1694 to 1914 in 1944, Solomon de Medina and two de Costas, Fonseca, Henriquez, Mendez, Nunez, Rodriguez, Salvador, and Tejera de Matos, who were all Sephardic Jews, had acquired the majority of the bank's shares by 1722. In 1786, Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger tried to abolish the national debt with a sinking fund which generated interest of £1 million per annum to repay the debt. This scheme was soon abandoned because of the enormous increase in loans incurred to finance the war against Napoleon. In 1797, in order to pay for the burgeoning interest burden, a system of graduated income tax had to be introduced, which by 1815 was yielding £70 million per annum. The war against France lasted from 1792 until 1815. Among the principal objectives of this pointless bloodletting was to destroy Napoleon's debt and interest-free system of finance. See Chapter 3. During this period, England also waged a war against the United States from 1812 until 1814. This war, as was the case with the war against France, was instigated by England at the behest of banker Mayer Amschel Rothschild, real name Bauer, after the United States Congress refused to renew the charter of the Rothschild-controlled Bank of the United States, which had been the Central Bank of America from 1791 until 1811. Mayer Amschel Rothschild is famously credited with having said, "Give me control of the economics of a country, and I care not who makes her laws. The few who understand the system will either be so interested from its profits or so dependent on its favors that there will be no opposition from that class." British Prime Minister Spencer Perceval, 1809 to 1812, tried to stop this completely futile war, but was assassinated on the 11th of May 1812 in the lobby of the House of Commons by John Bellingham, a political radical who had been set up by Rothschild. By 1815, the national debt had ballooned to £885 million. This completely unnecessary war resulted in approximately 3 million military personnel and at least 1 million civilians losing their lives. In order to destroy Napoleon's state bank, it cost the deluded British public a staggering £831 million, of which over £2.5 billion were still outstanding in 1914. The principal of £504 million had over the intervening period increased fivefold as a result of the compounding effect of interest. An astute agrarian and parliamentarian, William Cobbett, 1763 to 1835, at that time perceived what was afoot and wrote as follows: "I set to read the Act of Parliament by which the Bank of England was created. The investors knew what they were about. Their design was to mortgage by degrees the whole country, lands, houses, property, labor. The scheme had produced what the world never saw before: starvation in the midst of abundance." In 1800, a member of Parliament, Sir William Pulteney, proposed the formation of a national bank after having made vigorous attacks against the bank. In 1824, another member of Parliament, David Ricardo, submitted a detailed plan to convert the Bank of England into a national bank. Both attempts failed. The affairs of the Bank of England remained secret, and it was not until 1833, 139 years later, that a sanitized version of its accounts were presented to Parliament by means of the Act of 1833. At the start of World War I in 1914, the national debt stood at £650 million. On March 31, 1919, it had increased to £7.434 billion, of which £3 billion is still outstanding after 95 years at an interest rate of 3.5% per annum. In the 1919 budget, 40% of expenditure was allocated to the payment of interest. In World War II, the national debt rose by almost 300%, from £7.1 billion in 1939 to £20.1 billion in 1945. As of March 2017, it stands at over £1.8 trillion. However, if one includes all liabilities, including state and public pensions, it exceeds £5 trillion. Nationalization. On the 14th of February 1946, the Labour government nationalised the Bank of England. The shareholders received treasury notes to the value of £11,015,100, which were redeemable after 20 years. This nationalisation, which supposedly placed the bank under public control, did not introduce any change to the privately run system of fractional reserve banking and was undertaken purely for propaganda purposes as part of the Labour Party's nationalisation program of certain financial and industrial concerns. On the 6th of April 1974, the Bank of England established the Bank of England Nominees Limited, company registration number 1307478, a wholly owned subsidiary, with private shareholders holding its 100 £1 shares, of which 50% were sold. There is a suspicion that this rearrangement of the bank's affairs represents a reverse takeover of it by private shareholders. In view of the fact that certain aspects of the Bank of England's operations are protected by its Royal Charter, Section 27(9) of the Companies Act of 1976, and the Official Secrets Act of 1989, and are therefore not subject to public and parliamentary scrutiny, there may well be substance to this allegation. A History of Central Banking and the Enslavement of Mankind, by Stephen Mitford Goodson. Chapter 3. Napoleon and the Banque de France. The deadly facts herein revealed lead me to wonder that this monster, interest, has not devoured the whole human race. Napoleon Bonaparte, on being shown an interest table. France under the Bourbons. When the Bank of England was established in 1694, one of its principal aims was to provide sufficient finance so that England could prosecute its war against France. At that time, France was the premier world power both in terms of maritime forces and territorial possessions. 4 years previously, at the Battle of Beachy Head, near Eastbourne, England, the French Navy defeated the Anglo-Dutch fleet comprehensively, when it sank 12 ships, while a further 20 ships were exploded by their English crews. Since the 7th of June 1654, France had been ruled by its most glorious monarch, King Louis XIV, the Sun King. Louis was well versed in the wiles of the bankers. When he discovered that his superintendent of finances, Nicolas Fouquet, was a representative of what we term today the money power, and received irrefutable evidence that he had long been betraying the trust reposed in him by mishandling the state finances and by monstrous corruption, he had him arrested. Fouquet was put on trial and sentenced to complete isolation for the rest of his life in the inaccessible fortress of Pignerol. The War of Spanish Succession, 1702 to 1714, was the largest military conflict since the Crusades. It was fought after Louis declared his intention to place his grandson, Philip, Duke of Anjou, on the Spanish throne. This attempt, if successful, would have created a vast Franco-Spanish empire and posed a direct threat to the Bank of England and its proxy, the government of Great Britain. With the ability to create money out of nothing, the English were able to build a large fleet and buy the loyalty of France's enemies by bankrolling them. Louis held out for 9 years until his heirs suddenly started to die in unnatural circumstances. On the 13th of April 1711, his heir Louis, le Grand Dauphin, died allegedly of smallpox, even though he had the disease when he was a small child. On the 12th of February 1712, the wife of his grandson, the Duke of Burgundy, died of a fever. A few days later, her husband was covered in spots, and he died on the 18th of February 1712 of unknown causes. A few weeks later, the king's 2 great-grandsons fell ill with scarlet fever. The 5-year-old Duke of Brittany died on the 18th of March 1712. The 3-year-old brother, the Duke of Anjou, survived, miraculously, after the king ordered his isolation and treatment with an antidote. As a result of these tragedies, the king was persuaded to cease hostilities and commence negotiations. At Utrecht, a treaty was signed in March and April 1713, which allowed France to retain largely its pre-war boundaries. Thereafter, the heirs to the French throne stopped dying, although this did not prevent the other grandson of Louis, the Duke of Berry, who was the regent of the future Louis XV, dying in an unusual riding accident. A broken man, the Sun King died of natural causes on the 1st of September 1715. The ability of the English to command vast sums of money had not gone unnoticed by the French, who realized that the war had not been won because of a deficiency in financial credit. On the 1st of May 1716, a Scotsman, John Law, received a patent to open a private bank, the Banque Générale, which was patterned on the Bank of England and which was entitled to issue banknotes and exchange them for gold. The regent of Louis XV, Philippe II, Duke of Orleans, realized that this bank could provide government with a means of financing its expenditures, and in 1718, France's first central bank came into existence and was renamed the Banque Royale. The adoption of the Bank of England paradigm of creating money ex nihilo soon enabled the French economy to recover and flourish. However, this period of prosperity was of short duration. In January 1720, the French government received a record-breaking loan of 100 million livres, The following month, news spread suddenly that the bank was experiencing difficulty in exchanging its banknotes for gold coins, and an atrocious panic ensued. The source of these rumors is not clear, but the most likely suspect would have been the Bank of England, which wished to destroy its dangerous rival. Various attempts were made to shore up the Banque Royale. A decree of the 11th of March 1720 banned the use of coins from the 1st of May onwards. When this measure failed to staunch the impending catastrophe, a decree was announced on the 22nd of May 1720 which reduced the value of the banknotes by 50%. A third decree of the 10th of October 1720 stated that on the 1st of November, banknotes would no longer be used and that they were to be exchanged for state bonds with a further reduction of 50% in their value. In November 1720, the Banque Royale declared itself bankrupt, and its founder and controller general of finances, John Law, fled the country the following month. For the Bank of England and its Jewish stockholders, the demise of the Banque Royale was an unmitigated triumph. Napoleon, the monetary reformer. Napoleon, who was Emperor of France from 1804 to 1815, was very mindful of the fact that money always remains in hiding and only acts through agents, who are often unaware of the aims that they are pursuing. He realized that international money stood behind every foreign enemy, every monarch, and every political party, including the Jacobins, stating on one occasion that the hand that gives is above the hand that takes. Money has no motherland. Financiers are without patriotism and without decency. Their sole object is gain. He had very clear ideas as to how he wished the French economy to be run. He defined his system as being for the application of the resources of government, including finances, for the benefit and use of his people for the greater glory of God. His system was for the maintenance of spiritual as against material values, the nation as against political parties, patriotism as against greed, loyalty as against fear. The bedrock of the economy was to be agriculture, for that is the soul of the people, the foundations of the kingdom. Next in importance was industry, which ministers to the comfort and happiness of the population. A poor third came foreign trade, which only consists of the surplus of agriculture and industry. In his opinion, foreign trade ought to be the servant of agriculture and home industry. These last ought never to be subordinated to foreign trade. Napoleon's ultimate objective was to ensure not only financial independence, but self-sufficiency in the production of goods for domestic consumption. Napoleon would not allow loans to be employed for current expenditure, whether civil or military, under any circumstances. On the subject of debt, he had this to say: "One has only to consider what loans can lead to in order to realize their danger. Therefore, I would never have anything to do with them and have always striven against them. At one time, people asserted that I did not issue loans because I possessed no credit and could find nobody who would lend me anything. That is quite false. That surely implies a very scanty knowledge of human nature and an ignorance of stock exchange methods if people imagine that I could find no one ready to lend. It was not part of my system." The State Bank of the French Empire. Napoleon's first act on assuming power as First Consul on the 9th of November 1799 was to establish the Banque de France on the 18th of January 1800 as a joint stock company, which commenced operations on the 20th of February of that year. This bank replaced the 15, mainly Jewish, private banking houses which had been deeply involved in the events leading up to the Jewish Revolution against the French people, commonly, but incorrectly, known as the French Revolution from 1789 to 1799. These banks had increased the national debt to £170 million and had charged rapacious rates of interest on loans to the French crown, to the extent that, prior to 1789, it was allocating over 50% of its budget expenditure to interest. The bank was set up with a share capital of 30 million francs, divided into 30,000 shares of 1,000 francs each, of which a portion was subscribed by Napoleon, his family, and members of his entourage. The dividend of the shareholders was initially limited to 6% per annum, but was increased in 1806 to 2/3 of the bank's profits, with the remaining 1/3 being allocated to the bank's reserves. The 200 largest shareholders elected 15 regents, or directors, who sat on the general council administering the bank, and 3 censors, or inspectors, who supervised management of the bank. The general council, in turn, elected a central committee consisting of 3 members, one of whom was chairman. Napoleon made himself president of the bank, declaring that the bank does not belong to the shareholders only. It also belongs to the state, since the state has entrusted to it the privilege of issuing money. I wish the bank to be in sufficient measure in the hands of the state, but not too much so. On the 14th of April, 1803, by means of an act of Parliament, Napoleon abolished the right of 2 rival banks, the Caisse des Comptes de Commerce and the Comptoir Commercial, to issue banknotes, as he remarked at that time: "Have you not told me that, in order to preserve credit, it is a general practice that artificial money, like that of the Bank of France, shall issue from only one source? I adopt that idea. A single bank can be more easily watched than several concerns, both by the government and the public. With a view to emergencies, I cannot see any virtue in competition of this kind. On the 22nd of April, 1806, a new act was passed, which replaced the three-member Central Committee with a governor and two deputy governors. These appointments were personally vetted by Napoleon. The new act also increased the bank's capital to 90 million francs. Napoleon was so suspicious and distrustful of bankers that he personally supervised the operations of the treasury, lest the secrets of his monetary policies leak out and be exploited by speculators. He was thus his own banker, who controlled both the creation and distribution of money and credit to the chagrin of the international bankers, particularly the Rothschilds, who were virtually excluded from operating in continental markets. Napoleon made the franc the most stable currency in Europe. After France had abandoned the loan markets of the city of London, a fog of depression settled on its fraternity of bankers and usurers. In typical fashion, the English press began to stir up trouble for Napoleon. He was accused of having not observed the conditions of the Treaty of Amiens, which had been signed between England and France on the 25th of March, 1802. Relations broke down when Napoleon refused to sign a trade treaty, which would promote free trade and a modern-day version of globalization, and thereby force him to diminish the autarky and isolationism of his continental policy. England, under the direction of her international bankers, proceeded to bankroll Austria, Prussia, Russia, Spain, and Sweden, and duly declared war on France. The coalition forces exceeded 600,000. Napoleon could not muster even a third of that number, and would under normal circumstances have been compelled to secure a banker's loan in order to arm and feed them. On the 20th of December, 1803, he trumped the warmongers by selling Louisiana to the United States of America for £3 million. A brief period of peace and prosperity ensued. However, in 1806, a new coalition consisting of England, Russia, and Prussia, at the initiative of the last-named country, took to the field. Although the coalition forces were defeated at Jena on the 14th of October, 1806, Napoleon was forced to engage in a series of needless and senseless wars for the next 9 years in order to protect France and her new economic dispensation. He promulgated the Continental Blockade, whose objective was to destroy England's export trade, as he realized that England could not finance her imports and fund her allies at the same time. At the Treaty of Tilsit, signed on the 7th of July, 1807, on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River in East Prussia, Napoleon and Tsar Alexander I agreed to an alliance which made them the masters of continental Europe. Alexander agreed to join Napoleon's continental blockade of England and to provide each other with mutual support in the event of disputes with other nations, and in particular the British Empire. At that time, France and Russia were the only two countries in Europe which were not on the usury system and were furthermore not indebted to the Rothschilds. They were therefore the only free and independent nations. However, a few years later, Russia started to violate the blockade. This action was premised on the fact that Russia, a producer of mainly raw materials, had very little industrial capacity and had been dependent on England for the importation of industrial products. Alexander was only prepared to continue with the blockade, subject to France supplying him with the industrial goods, which he had previously imported from England. France could not supply these goods, as England commanded the seas and there was no road or rail infrastructure in Europe at that time. Therefore, in order to enforce the blockade, Napoleon decided to invade Russia on the 24th of June, 1812, with an army of over 500,000 soldiers. Although he reached Moscow on the 14th of September, 1812, he found that it had been abandoned, and the subsequent winter retreat turned into a major disaster, with only 110,000 of his original army surviving. The following year, Napoleon was defeated at the Battle of the Nations, east of Leipzig, on the 19th of October, 1813. On the 11th of April, 1814, he abdicated at Fontainebleau. After being banished to the island of Elba, situated between Corsica and Tuscany, Napoleon attempted to stage a comeback at the Battle of Waterloo in modern-day Belgium on the 18th of June, 1815. All the belligerents, England, Prussia, and France, were financed by Nathan Rothschild, with France receiving a loan of £10 million. After his defeat, Napoleon was exiled to the British island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, where he died under suspicious circumstances when he was still a fit man at the age of 51, on the 5th of May, 1821. An examination of Napoleon's remains has indicated that he almost certainly died of cyanide poisoning following chronic arsenic intoxication. In such a case, it would undoubtedly have been the work of a Rothschild assassin, which conforms to a pattern repeated consistently during the past 2 centuries of assassinating all leaders who propose, institute, or maintain systems of usury-free banking. As part of Napoleon's plan to assimilate Jews into French society, he issued a decree in 1808 ordering all Jews to adopt surnames and to use those names on all documents. Napoleon, in a letter to his younger brother Jerome, written in 1808, states, "I have undertaken to reform the Jews, but I have not endeavored to draw more of them into my realm. It is necessary to reduce, if not destroy, the tendency of Jewish people to practice a very great number of activities that are harmful to civilization and to public order in society in all the countries of the world. It is necessary to stop the harm by preventing it. To prevent it, it is necessary to change the Jews. Once part of their youth will take its place in our armies, they will cease to have Jewish interests and sentiments. Their interests and sentiments will be French. Achievements of the French state banking system. As part of the Code Napoleon, Code civil de Français, Napoleon introduced a new commercial code on the 21st of March, 1804. These economic reforms, which included substantially reduced taxes, quickly turned the French economy around and resulted in increased trade and the development of new industries, such as cotton making and sugar beet, which were assisted by tariffs against foreign goods and low interest rate loans. The infrastructure was upgraded on a vast scale not only in France, but throughout Western Europe, with the construction of 20,000 miles, 32,186 kilometers, of imperial roads and 12,000 miles, 19,312 kilometers, of regional roads, almost 1,000 miles, 1,609 kilometers of canals, bridges, and dredging, and expansion of harbors such as Cherbourg and Dunkirk, waterworks and public buildings, such as the Gallery at the Louvre, all financed with interest-free money from the Banque de France. Napoleon also established an industrial board, which provided data and information to French industry, the Imperial University, which administered French education, specialized schools, or lycée, for the study of engineering, science, and technology, and professional schools devoted to midwifery, obstetrics, and veterinary science. Napoleon described these accomplishments to his Irish doctor, Barry O'Meara, on the island of St. Helena, and said that they were his most enduring monument. The Allied powers cannot take from me hereafter the great public works I have executed, the roads which I have made over the Alps, and the seas I have united. They cannot place their feet to improve where mine have not been before. They cannot take from the code of laws which I formed, and which will go down to posterity. In conclusion, we may consider some of Napoleon's achievements, which he communicated to his former chamberlain and constant companion for 18 months on St. Helena, Comte de las Casas. I inspired France and Europe with new ideas which will never be forgotten. France's finances are the best in the world. To whom does she owe them? If I had not been overthrown, I would have made a complete change in the appearance of commerce as well as of industry. The efforts of the French people were extraordinary. Prosperity and progress were growing immeasurably. Enlightenment was making giant strides. New ideas were everywhere heard and published, for I took pains to introduce science among the people. If I had been given time, there would soon have been no more artisans in France. They would all have become artists. A History of Central Banking and the Enslavement of Mankind, by Stephen Mitford Goodson. Chapter 4. A Century of Struggle. Rothschild versus the People. Who hold the balance of the world? Who reign o'er Congress, whether royalist or liberal? Who rouse the shirtless patriots of Spain, that make old Europe's journals squeak and gibber? Who keep the world both old and new in pain or pleasure? Who make politics run glibber all? The shade of Bonaparte's noble daring, Jew Rothschild, and his fellow Christian, Baring. Lord Byron, 12th Canto. Central Banking in the United States. As this section will show, all previous encounters which the United States has experienced with central banking have been very negative. During the colonial period, the American colonies created their own paper money. The first colony to do so was Massachusetts in 1691. Pennsylvania, New York, Delaware, and Maryland soon followed suit. They called their currency colonial script, or bills of credit. It freed them from the control of the English banks and enabled them to run their financial affairs in an inflation-free environment with few taxes. Throughout the colonies sustained, stable economic growth and prosperity were achieved, which would not have been possible under a privately run banking system based on usury. In 1763, American statesman Benjamin Franklin, 1706 to 1790, visited London, where he was shocked to observe slum conditions and the wide prevalence of poverty. When the British Parliament asked Franklin to explain the source of prosperity of the American colonies, he replied as follows: "That is simple. In the colonies, we issue our own money. It is called colonial script. We issue it in proportion to the demands of trade and industry to make the products pass easily from the producers to the consumers. In this manner, creating for ourselves our own money, we control its purchasing power, and we have no interest to pay anyone." The following year, in 1764, the Bank of England introduced a currency bill which severely restricted the colonies' rights to issue their own money and forbade its legal tender status for the payment of private and public debts. Instead, the bank ordered them to issue bonds at interest and sell them to the Bank of England in exchange for English money. In the event, only half of the currency was remitted. As a consequence of this law, the economy of the colonies collapsed, and within 1 year, more than half the population became unemployed and destitute. The Stamp Act of 1765 was the last straw, but the abolition of the colonial currency was the primary cause of the revolution. One of the first tasks entrusted to the Second Continental Congress, which convened for the first time on the 10th of May, 1775, was to issue its own currency, largely to finance its war expenditures. A total of $241,552,788 was issued during the currency's existence. The Bank of England quickly responded. Hundreds of workmen were recruited, and soon millions of dollars worth of counterfeit banknotes were rolling off the printing presses and being shipped to New York. The continental dollar retained much of its purchasing power during the first 2 years of its issuance, but once the English counterfeit banknotes started to increase in circulation, its value soon fell away, and by 1780, $1 was worth only 2.5 cents. 15 years later, in 1790, the Bank of England mounted another similar operation, when it employed over 400 workmen in 17 factories in southern and central England to print the assignat, which was the currency of revolutionary France. The assignat, which was backed by clerical lands, was in its initial stages successfully circulated as a means of exchange, and a significant portion of the national debt was repaid. However, by 1792, the massive infusion of counterfeit notes soon caused the assignat to plummet in value, and thereafter there was a brief period of hyperinflation. On the 14th of April, 1803, Napoleon Bonaparte introduced the government-issued franc, which acquired the status of legal tender in 1808. Already in 1781, before the conclusion of the War of Independence on the 11th of April 1783, Robert Morris, 1734 to 1806, Superintendent of Finance, introduced a bill which restored the new state to servitude with the establishment of the Bank of North America. This bank commenced operations on the 4th of January, 1782. It attracted large deposits of silver and gold coin and bills of exchange obtained through loans from France and the Netherlands, which enabled it to issue paper currency on the strength of these reserves. Between 1791 and 1796, inflation surged by 72%. In 1795, the state of Pennsylvania withdrew its jurisdiction on account of alarming foreign influence and fictitious credit. On the 25th of February, 1791, the Bank of North America was succeeded by a second central bank, which was chartered as the first bank of the United States. It was imposed as a result of the intrigues of Alexander Hamilton, the Secretary of the Treasury, whose actions indicate that he was working hand in glove with the directors of the Bank of England, as it was modeled on that bank. The new bank had a capital of $10 million, of which 20% was held by the U.S. government and the balance by private investors. The bank was strongly opposed by future presidents John Adams, James Madison, and Thomas Jefferson, then Secretary of State, who would later state that the central bank is an institution of the most deadly hostility existing against the principles and form of our Constitution. I believe that the banking institutions are more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies. Already they have raised up a moneyed aristocracy that has set the government at defiance. The issuing power should be taken from the banks and restored to the people to whom it properly belongs. If the American people ever allow the banks to control the issuance of their currency, first by inflation and then by deflation, the banks and corporations that grow up around them will deprive the people of all property until their children will wake up homeless on the continent their fathers occupied. The following year, the bank organized the first crash, known as the Panic of 1792. By flooding the market with cheap loans and suddenly calling most of them in, the bank precipitated a 25% plunge in the price of 6% Treasury bonds, which resulted in financial chaos. By the end of 1795, the bank had lent $6 million to government, or 60% of its capital. As the bank was allegedly concerned about the stability of government finances, it demanded partial repayment of this loan. The government did not have the funds available and was therefore forced to sell its shareholding in the bank between the years 1796 and 1802. By means of this cunning ruse, the bank became 100% privately owned, of which 75% of the shares were held by foreigners. In 1811, the bank's charter came up for renewal. The bank was concealing its profits, operating in a clandestine manner, and was believed to be unconstitutional. It was designed primarily to serve the business interests of the North at the expense of the agricultural development of the South, while the Democrats, Republicans, Jeffersonians wanted to abolish it. Former President Thomas Jefferson was one of those who violently opposed renewal of the bill. What particularly irked the legislators was the fact that the bank was now 100% in the ownership of foreigners. The press variously described the central bank bill as a great swindle, a vulture, a viper, and a cobra. Furthermore, they contended that it was the constitutional right of Congress to regulate weights and measures and issue coined money. The bill was defeated by a wafer-thin margin of 65 to 64 votes, which was an achievement, as there is a strong likelihood that many of the yes votes were bought. On the 3rd of March, 1811, the bank finally closed its doors. When the principal shareholder of the First Bank of the United States, Mayor Amschel Rothschild, heard about the deep dissension regarding the renewal of the bank's charter, he flew into a rage and declared that either the application for renewal of the charter is granted, or the United States will find itself involved in a most disastrous war. He also said that, I will teach those impudent Americans a lesson and bring them back to colonial status. Rothschild tried to influence the British Prime Minister Spencer Perceval into declaring war on the United States in order to resurrect his privately owned central bank. In 1807, Perceval joined the cabinet as Chancellor of the Exchequer. At that time, England was at war with France, and one of his principal tasks was to raise money in order to finance the war. Instead of increasing taxes, he raised a number of loans, initially from the Barings Bank, and thereafter mainly from the Rothschilds. Perceval's secretary was John Charles Harries, who had been appointed to that position 5 years previously. Harries was an intimate of Nathan Rothschild, and until his death in 1858 faithfully served the Rothschild cause in the various positions he held in the British government as First Lord of the Treasury, Commissary General to the Army, and Chancellor of the Exchequer. Meanwhile, Rothschild agent provocateurs were stoking up discontent in North America. In order to provoke the Americans, the British started to interfere with U.S. trade with France, which had imposed a continental blockade against England. As the Royal Navy was short of sailors, they engaged in forced recruitment or impressment of American sailors. They also supplied the Indian tribes, and in particular the Shawnee chief Tecumseh, with arms in order to frustrate and curtail the settlers' westward expansion. The Americans, on their part, indicated a desire to seize parts of Canada. Concurrently, Perceval was facing increased pressure from Nathan Rothschild to make a declaration of war on the United States. He refused. The British army was already bogged down in a stalemate situation in Spain and Portugal, the Peninsular War of 1808 to 1814, with Napoleon's forces, and he had no desire to commit more troops and treasure, financed by more interest-bearing bank loans, simply in order to save Rothschild's sinking banking interests in America. The assassin of Spencer Perceval, John Bellingham, was born about 1769 in St. Neots, Huntingdonshire. From 1800 to 1802, he worked in Arkhangelsk as an agent for importers and exporters. He returned to Russia in 1804, and in November of that year, he was falsely accused of having reneged on a debt of 4,890 rubles, which subsequently led to his imprisonment for 4 years. On his release, Bellingham took up residence in Duke Street, Liverpool. He unsuccessfully petitioned the government for compensation. Bellingham, a bitter and aggrieved man, fell into company with two dissolute American merchants, Thomas Wilson and Elisha Peck, who were both keen to have orders in council, which forbade neutral nations from trading with France, abrogated. These orders in council had been introduced by Perceval in response to Napoleon's continental blockade, which the latter had instituted in 1806 and prohibited trade with Britain and Ireland. Their continuation was due to be debated in Parliament on that fateful evening. Thus we observe a confluence of interests, a disturbed and resentful man, two greedy merchants, and the puppet master Rothschild pulling the strings in the background. At 5:15 p.m. on the 11th of May, 1812, as Perceval entered the lobby of the House of Commons, Bellingham stepped forward and shot him in the heart. Perceval collapsed, uttering, "Murder! Oh my God!" and within minutes was dead. 4 days later, Bellingham was put on trial at the Old Bailey. The trial lasted 3 days. A plea of insanity was rejected. The brevity of the trial was presumably related to the necessity of preventing any untoward disclosures. As is customary with this type of political assassination, the lone assassin theory has to be preserved at all costs. On the 18th of May, 1812, Bellingham was hanged. A few weeks later, after Perceval's murder, the orders in council forbidding neutral nations trading with France were revoked. In the United States House of Representatives, Henry Clay, who was a Freemason, led a group of young Democratic Republicans known as the War Hawks. The vote to declare war was decided on the 1st of June, 1812, by 79 votes to 49, with all 39 Federalists voting to support it. In the Senate, the vote was decided by 19 to 13 votes. As there was no unanimity, critics frequently referred to it as Mr. Madison's War. In England, Perceval's successor, Lord Robert Liverpool, was an enthusiastic supporter of the war. However, neither belligerent was able to achieve its objectives, except Nathan Rothschild, who realized his aim of setting up the Second Bank of the United States on the 10th of April, 1816. When hostilities ceased over 2 years later, on the 24th of August, 1814, over 24,000 lives had been lost. The war was very costly to the United States in financial terms. It incurred a huge war debt of $105 million relative to its population of 8 million. As a result thereof, the national debt increased by 182% from $45 million in 1812 to $127 million in 1815. Peace was signed in Ghent, Belgium, on the 24th of December, 1814. The Second Bank of the United States had an enlarged capital of $35 million. The bank immediately established a large number of branch banks to lend fiat money at compound rates of interest. In 1822, President James Monroe appointed Nicholas Biddle president of the bank. Biddle had first made contact with the Rothschilds while on government business in Paris in 1804, while acting as secretary to United States Minister to France, John Armstrong. As president of the bank, he acted as point man to James de Rothschild, who was the bank's principal investor. The artificially induced recession of 1819 to 1821, which was very profitable for the bankers who were able to buy up assets at depressed prices, convinced the leader of the Democrats, Andrew Jackson, that the only way to terminate these abuses was to close down the central bank. In his re-election campaign in 1832, he declared that the monster must perish, and his chief slogan was, "Vote Andrew Jackson, no bank." He stated that if Congress has the right under the Constitution to issue paper money, it was given to them to be used by themselves, not to be delegated to individuals or corporations. He also said that if the American people only understood the rank injustice of our banking and money system, there would be a revolution before morning. Notwithstanding a failed assassination attempt on the 30th of January, 1835, by a presumed Rothschild agent, Richard Lawrence, when the 20-year charter of the Second Bank of the United States came up for renewal in 1836, Jackson collapsed the bank by withdrawing all government deposits. He promptly repaid the national debt in its entirety, leaving a surplus of $50 million in the Treasury. The central bank was replaced by an independent Treasury system based on redeemable paper and specie. During President John Tyler's term of office, 1841 to 1845, 2 attempts were made by Congress under the sponsorship of the former Speaker of the House of Representatives, Henry Clay, to renew the charter of the Bank of the United States. Clay, who had in 1820 become Grand Master of the Kentucky Lodge, was another agent deemed to be under the influence of the Rothschilds. Tyler vetoed both of these bills and was subsequently inundated with hundreds of letters threatening him with assassination. For the next 77 years, the United States developed without the need of a central bank. Its means of exchange were funded primarily by debt and interest-free Treasury greenback dollar bills, first issued by President Abraham Lincoln in 1862 in order to finance his military expenditure during the Civil War, and gold and silver coins. Up to 1873, gold and silver could be coined at any U.S. mint free of charge. After having rejected offers by private bankers to lend money to the United States government at interest rates varying between 24% and 36% per annum, Lincoln had, on the advice of his friend Colonel Dick Taylor, issued $347 million of currency at no cost to the American people except for the expense of printing and distribution. Lincoln's defiance of Lionel Rothschild and his uncle James resulted in his assassination on the night of the 15th of April, 1865, by John Wilkes Booth, real name Botha, at the behest of the Rothschilds' local agent named Rothberg. The American Civil War, 1861 to 1865, left the U.S. government with a war debt of $5 billion. As a result of inflation, these bonds had declined in value to $2.5 billion. Large quantities of these bonds were bought up by Rothschild's agent August Belmont in the hope of realizing them at their face value in gold. In the 1868 presidential election, the Democratic Party candidate George H. Pendleton pledged payment only in paper. He was soon replaced by Horatio Seymour on the initiative of Belmont, who had assumed chairmanship of the Democratic National Committee in 1860. Seymour promised payment in specie. However, when the convention passed a resolution in favor of paper, Belmont was forced to switch sides and thereafter secretly supported the Republican candidate, General Ulysses S. Grant, and used his part ownership of the New York World newspaper in order to denigrate and undermine the chances of Seymour. Grant won, and, on assuming office in 1869, he promptly introduced the Public Credit Act, which paid out the face value on the $5 billion worth of bonds in gold. This resulted in the Rothschilds and their associates making a 100% profit. The silver exchange was abolished and replaced by a gold standard by means of an act revising and amending the laws relative to the mints, assay offices, and the coinage of the United States. On the 17th of January, 1873, this act was passed by the Senate. According to a sworn affidavit of Mr. Frederick A. Luckenbach dated the 9th of May, 1892, he had learnt from Mr. Ernst Sade in London that the demonetization of American silver had been expressly ordered by the governors of the Bank of England, who had furthermore paid £100,000, $500,000, in order to have a sufficient number of committee members of the U.S. Congress dealing with financial matters bribed. This nefarious deed became known as the Crime of 1873. The forced abandonment of the people's money, silver, was also instituted in the German Empire when the government inexplicably ceased to mint silver dollar coins in 1871. There seems to be little doubt that this was part of a synchronized scheme coordinated by the Rothschilds in order to further entrench the gold standard. The gold standard wrought havoc on the American economy and enabled private bankers to withhold loans and restrict the money supply at will. There followed a series of unnaturally created panics or bank runs in 1873, 1884, 1890 to 01, 1893 to 94, 1897, 1903, and 1907. These artificially created bank runs so incensed President James Abram Garfield that shortly after he took office on the 4th of March, 1881, he issued a statement in the middle of June of that year that he intended to master the problem when he said the following: "Whosoever controls the volume of money in any country is absolute master of all industry and commerce. And when you realize that the entire system is very easily controlled, one way or another, by a few powerful men at the top, you will not have to be told how periods of inflation and depression originate." 2 weeks later, Garfield was gunned down by lone assassin Charles J. Guiteau, who had a grievance for not having received a diplomatic posting. Garfield did not die immediately, but as a result of improper medical care, quite possibly done so deliberately, lingered on until his death on the 19th of September, 1881. At his trial, the hidden hand of Rothschild was revealed when Guiteau claimed that important men in Europe put him up to the task and had promised to protect him if he were caught. The 1907 panic had the worst effects. In early 1907, Jacob Schiff, CEO of Kuhn Loeb & Company, worried that unless we have a central bank with adequate control of credit resources, this country is going to undergo the most severe and far-reaching money panic in history. In October of that year, J.P. Morgan, another Rothschild frontman, set the panic in motion by circulating rumors that its rival, the Knickerbocker Bank and Trust Company, was insolvent. In the ensuing crash, shares listed on the New York Stock Exchange lost 50% of their value. Further consequences of this deliberately induced panic were an 11% drop in industrial production the following year, a 26% rise in imports, and an increase in unemployment from under 3% to 8%. It was these continual phases of artificially created boom and bust, inflation and deflation, which provided the motivation and pretext to set up a central bank, which would allegedly solve all these never-ending problems for all time. Establishment of the United States Federal Reserve Bank. In order to mislead the public, two alternative plans were proposed. One was advanced by the National Monetary Commission under leadership of Senator Nelson Aldrich, grandfather of Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller, and known as the Aldrich Plan. The other plan, adopted by the Special Currency Committee of the New York Chamber of Commerce, was under the chairmanship of Paul Warburg, a German Jewish banker, who was acting on behalf of the Rothschild interest headed by Baron Alfred Rothschild. It was known as the Wall Street Plan. Except for the distribution of reserves, both plans were identical and had as their aim the establishment of a central reserve bank. On the 22nd of November, 1910, the banking conspirators included among others A. Piatt Andrew, Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, Frank Vanderlip, President of the National City Bank of New York, Henry P. Davidson, Senior Partner, J.P. Morgan & Company, Charles D. Norton, President, First National Bank of New York, Benjamin Strong, Vice President, Bankers Trust of New York, and Paul Moritz Warburg, Partner, Kuhn Loeb & Company, sneaked out of New York in Aldrich's Pullman car with all its blinds drawn from Hoboken, New Jersey railway station to Jekyll Island, Georgia. At the very exclusive Jekyll Island Hunt Club, owned by J.P. Morgan, the fate of the American people and indeed the world would be determined over the next 10 days by this group of criminally inclined financiers, who are also known as the First Name Club. Only first names were used so as not to reveal their identities to the staff. The bill to establish the United States Federal Reserve Bank was vehemently opposed by Congressman Charles August Lindbergh, who said that this act establishes the most gigantic trust on earth, such as the Sherman Antitrust Act would dissolve if Congress did not by this act expressly create what by that act it prohibited. When the President signs this act, the invisible government by the money power, proven to exist by the Pujo Money Trust investigation, will be legalized. The greatest crime of Congress is its currency system. The schemiest legislative crime of all ages is perpetuated by this new banking and currency bill. The bill was bitterly opposed in the Senate, with Senator Robert M. La Follette being one of its most vociferous opponents. It was passed into law on the 23rd of December, 1913, after the members of the Senate had been threatened by the thoroughly disreputable President Woodrow Wilson, who was as devoid of ethics and principle as he was of morality, that he would keep them in session until it had passed the bill and deny them their Christmas recess. Only a minority of 43 senators supported the bill, with 25 voting against it, 27 refusing to vote, and 5 members absent. The promoters of the bill promised that the United States dollar would become a stable currency and that business cycles and recessions would become a thing of the past. In the event since the inception of the U.S. Federal Reserve Bank in 1914, the U.S. dollar has lost 97% of its purchasing power, and there have been 19 recessions. The Great Depression of the 1930s, and the current Great Recession, which started in 2008, and notwithstanding mainstream media propaganda to the contrary, appears to have all the symptoms of a depression. Since 1910, the national debt has increased from $2.65 billion to $20 trillion in March 2017, while unfunded liabilities such as Social Security, Medicare, and benefits for military veterans exceed $240 trillion. The United States Federal Reserve Bank, instead of functioning as the people's banker of the bankers, has operated solely as a private bank for the benefit of private bankers. It comes as no surprise that in its 104 years of existence, its accounts have never been submitted to public audit. The following are the bank's principal shareholders: Rothschild Banks of London and Berlin, Lazard Brothers Banks of Paris, Israel Moses Seif Banks of Italy, Warburg Bank of Hamburg and Amsterdam, Shearson American Express, Goldman Sachs of New York, J.P. Morgan Chase Bank. The State Bank of the Russian Empire. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, a different system of finance, viz. State banking, had been adopted. From September 1814 to June 1815, the Congress of Vienna was held in order to settle the issues arising from the French Revolutionary Wars, the Napoleonic Wars, and the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire. Behind the scenes, Nathan Mayer Rothschild proposed the formation of a new world order concentrated around central banking. All the major powers, with the exception of Russia, were indebted to the Rothschild banks. Tsar Alexander I, 1801 to 1825, refused to comply with Rothschild's devious scheme and derailed it. Instead, he established the Holy Alliance between Austria, Prussia, and Russia, which was signed on the 26th of September 1815 by Emperor Francis I of Austria, King Friedrich Wilhelm III of Prussia, and Tsar Alexander. He also rejected Rothschild's offer to set up a central bank in Russia. Whether it was because he distrusted the shady banker or was aware of the perils of central banking is not known, but he wisely declined. However, his prudent behavior incurred the vindictive and unrelenting wrath of the Rothschilds, who, according to Major General Count Sheriff-Spiridovich, were responsible for the assassination of the last 5 czars and would seek and obtain their Talmudic vengeance in spectacular fashion 102 years later. On the 12th of June, 1860, the State Bank of the Russian Empire was founded with the aim of boosting trade turnovers and the strengthening of the monetary system. Up to 1894, it was an auxiliary institution under the direct control of the Ministry of Finance. In that year, it was transformed into being the banker of the bankers and operated as an instrument of government's policy. It minted and printed the nation's coins and notes, regulated the money supply, and through commercial banks, provided industry and commerce with low interest rate loans. Its vast gold reserves, the largest in the world, exceeded the banknote issue by more than 100%, except for the year 1906. By 1914, it had become one of the most influential lending institutions in Europe. Not unexpectedly, Russia had the smallest national debt in the world. The following table reflects the number of rubles of debt per inhabitant. France, 288. Great Britain, 169.8. Germany, 135.6. Russia, 58.7. By 1914, 83% of the interest and amortization of the national debt, of which less than 2% was held abroad, was funded by the profits of the Russian state railways. In 1916, the total length of the main lines was 100,817 verst, or kilometers. Russian commercial and canal tonnage of 11,130,000 in 1910 exceeded British merchant tonnage of 10,750,000. In 1861, Tsar Alexander II, 1855 to 1881, abolished serfdom, which at that time affected 30% of the population. By 1914, very little land remained in the possession of the Russian estate owners, who were mainly the nobility. 80% of the arable land was in the hands of the peasants, which had been ceded to them for a very small sum. This land was held in trust by the village commune, or mir. However, after the passing of the Stolypin Act in 1906, peasants could obtain individual title with hereditary rights. By 1913, 2 million families had availed themselves of this opportunity to acquire what became known as Stolypin farms. Nearly 19 million acres, 7,689,027 hectares, were allotted to these individual peasant proprietors by the land committees. The Peasants' State Bank, which was described at that time as the greatest and most socially beneficent institution of land credit in the world, granted loans at a low rate of interest, which was in effect a handling charge. Between 1901 and 1912, these loans increased from 222 million rubles to 1.168 billion rubles. Agricultural production soared so that, by 1913, Russia had become the world's breadbasket, as the following table reveals. Russia provided 42.3% of the world's barley, 30.3% of the world's oats, 67% of the world's rye, and 31.2% of the world's wheat. Russian agricultural production of cereals exceeded the combined production of Argentina, Canada, and the United States by 25%. In 1913, Russia had 37.5 million horses, more than half of all those in the world. She also produced 80% of the world's flax and provided more than 50% of the world's egg imports. Mining and industrial output also expanded by huge margins. Between 1885 and 1913, coal production increased from 259.6 million poods to 2,159.8 million poods. Cast iron production rose from 25 million poods in 1890 to 1,378 million poods in 1913, and petroleum production rose from 491.2 million poods in 1906 to 602.1 million poods in 1916. From 1870 to 1914, industrial output grew by 1% per annum in Great Britain, 2.75% per annum in the United States, and 3.5% per annum in Russia. During the period from 1890 to 1913, industrial production quadrupled, and Russian industries were able to satisfy 80% of internal demand for manufactured goods, a perfect example of autarky. Throughout the last 20 years of peacetime imperial rule, 1895 to 1914, the increase in gross domestic product averaged 10% per annum. With the Russian state bank creating the people's money out of nothing at almost zero interest, as opposed to the rest of the world where central banks allowed parasitic private banks to create their nation's money supply at usurious rates of interest, it comes as no surprise to find that in 1912, Russia had the lowest levels of taxation in the world. These very low rates of taxation also attest to the efficiency of the Russian government. Furthermore, throughout this period of state banking, there was no inflation and no unemployment. Between 1897 and 1913, state receipts rose from 1.4 million gold rubles to 3.471 million gold rubles. By 1914, the surplus on the budget account was 512 million gold rubles, and there was no increase in taxation. Throughout the same period, the foreign trade balance between exports and imports was in surplus. An indication of the financial health of the Russian economy can be gauged from the following comparative table of gold reserves. The gold reserves in banknotes are expressed in millions of rubles. An independent study by British lawyers concluded that the Russian code of laws and judiciary were the most advanced and impartial in the world. Elementary education was obligatory and free, right up to university level, where only nominal fees were charged. Between 1906 and 1914, 10,000 schools were opened annually. Russian universities were renowned for their high academic standards. In labor relations, the Russians were pioneers. Child labor was abolished over 100 years before it was abolished in Great Britain in 1867. Russia was the first industrialized country to pass laws limiting the hours of work in factories and mines. Strikes, which were forbidden in the Soviet Union, were permitted and minimal in Tsarist times. Trade union rights were recognized in 1906, while an inspectorate of labor strictly controlled working conditions in factories. In 1912, social insurance was introduced. Labor laws were so advanced and humane that President William Taft of the United States was moved to say that the Emperor of Russia has passed workers' legislation which was nearer to perfection than that of any democratic country. The people of all races in the Russian Empire had an equality of status and opportunity, which was unparalleled in the modern world. His Imperial Majesty Tsar Nicholas II, 1868 to 1917, and his state bank had created a workers' paradise that was unrivaled in the history of mankind. On the 17th of November, 1917, the Rothschilds, fearful the replication of this extraordinary example of freedom and prosperity would destroy their malevolent banking empire, instigated and financed a Judeo-Bolshevik revolution in Russia, which wrecked and ruined a wonderful country and resulted in the deaths by murder and starvation, according to Alexander Solzhenitsyn, of 66 million innocent people. The creation and control of the Soviet Union. In Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, author Professor Anthony Sutton, with the assistance of State Department documents and personal papers of American international bankers, details the enthusiastic alliance of Wall Street and Marxist socialism. Without the financial support of J.P. Morgan's Guarantee Trust Company, John D. Rockefeller's Chase National Bank, Jacob Schiff's Kuhn-Loeben Company, and Ulf Ashberg of the Swedish Nordbanken, the Judeo-Bolshevik Revolution would not have succeeded. Of more particular interest in the financing of the revolution is the role which Maxim Litvinov, 1876 to 1951, who was born Meyer Genoch Moskowitz Wallach Finkelstein, played as a revolutionary in destroying Imperial Russia and handing it over to the international bankers. Litvinov commenced his revolutionary career in 1898. In 1901, he was arrested and spent 18 months in prison, from which he escaped. In 1903, he was entrusted with money, which was used to finance and distribute the newspaper of the Russian Socialist Democratic Party, Iskra, which was printed in London. In 1905, Litvinov received further funds from Friends from Abroad, which enabled the purchase of arms, again in London. Thereafter, Litvinov, now known as Papasha or Daddy, became the source of all foreign funds and was appointed treasurer of the party, a decision which Lenin could not overrule, because Litvinov was a representative of the Rothschilds with powers exceeding those of Lenin. Lenin was merely informed of the decision. A few months later, at a meeting in Geneva, Litvinov was elected Secretary of Foreign Transport Groups. Lenin was again informed of this decision. Litvinov was never a genuine revolutionary, but instead used Bolshevism as a disguise in order to advance the aims of his master's agenda. From 1908 to 1918, Litvinov resided in London with the assistance of his English friends. During this period, he held a variety of occupations working for a publishing house, Williams & Norgate, a tourist agency, and selling farm machinery. Presumably, these occupations provided a suitable cover for his clandestine activities. In 1914, at the outbreak of World War I, the Russian government demanded that all its citizens be returned to Russia in order to serve in the army. However, the British authorities allowed Litvinov to remain. In 1916, Litvinov married a daughter of one of the most distinguished Jewish families in England, Ivy Lowe. On the 3rd of January 1918, Litvinov was appointed as the authorized representative of Soviet Russia. One of his first tasks was to demand that the money held at the Bank of England on behalf of the Tsarist embassy be handed over to him. The bank duly complied. In September 1918, a conspiracy against the Bolsheviks involving British ambassador Robert Bruce Lockhart was exposed. Both Lockhart and Litvinov were arrested by their respective governments, and as a result of a subsequent exchange, Litvinov returned to Moscow. His new assignment was to secure fast outflow of gold and jewelry from Russia via Scandinavia under the cover of a scheme to purchase steam engines later known as gold engines. A quarter of Russia's gold reserves were transferred to Sweden for onward transshipment. For the Rothschilds, it was now retribution time. On the 21st of April, 1921, Litvinov was appointed Commissioner of the Council of People's Commissars for Currency Transactions and Sales of Gold Abroad. Several hundred millions, rubles, of our gold went through my hands and was sold abroad. I sold the majority of this gold directly or through various intermediaries to large French companies, which remelted this gold either in France or Switzerland, and then this gold went to its final destination in storage at the American Reserve Bank, Rothschild's privately owned bank. Litvinov had become the authorized representative of the bankers, owners of the FRB, the Bank of England, and Soviet Russia. As can be seen, the Bolshevik Revolution was little more than a giant asset-stripping exercise by the Rothschilds. In December 1921, the Kuzbas Autonomous Industrial Colony was established. It handed over control of a vast industrial complex to a group of American and European investors who had assisted in financing it. Thereafter, millions of gold rubles flowed abroad without any customs duties, allegedly as interest for the capital invested by European bankers, despite the fact that the investments were not all that large. In 1924, Joseph Stalin became the leader of the Soviet Union, but Litvinov, who feared no one, remained preeminent. His rudeness to Stalin was legendary. In the purge of 1937 to 1938, nearly all of Litvinov's deputies were arrested and then shot. Litvinov pleaded for the life of one of his closest friends, Boris Domonyakov, and informed Stalin that he could vouch for him. Stalin looked Litvinov in his eyes and replied, "Comrade Litvinov, you can only vouch for yourself." From 1930 to 1939, Litvinov was People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs of the Soviet Union. In 1939, relations between National Socialist Germany and the Soviet Union started to thaw a little. This was anathema to Litvinov's masters, who had nightmarish memories of the Holy Alliance struck between Austria, Prussia, and Russia in 815, and Bismarck's Drei Kaiserbund, Three Emperors League, concluded between the same three empires in 1872. Litvinov objected, but by this time Stalin had had enough of Litvinov's impudent behavior. On the 3rd of May 1939, a quiet coup d'etat took place and Stalin dismissed the puppet of the banking underworld from the position of foreign minister. With its own state bank of the USSR, or Gosbank, which was founded on the 16th of November 1921, the Soviet Union had finally gained its sovereignty and independence from the international bankers. All Litvinov's deputies and heads of departments were arrested, but he himself was spared, as he was untouchable. Litvinov was allowed to retire to his dacha, but was kept under constant surveillance. In late 1941, Litvinov's services were once again required. With the Germans banging on the gates of Moscow, Stalin's desperate situation necessitated urgent help from the West. Litvinov was sent to Washington as Soviet ambassador. The Americans were reluctant to lend money to the Soviet Union, but Litvinov soon sorted everything out, and within a few weeks, a loan of $1 billion was granted. A lend-lease agreement was signed, and over the next 4 years, $11 billion worth of supplies and services were provided. Litvinov could call the White House at any time, and the president, Roosevelt, would see him immediately. Both these stooges of the international bankers pumped gold, the one out of Russia, the other from the people of the United States, into the vaults of Rothschild's Federal Reserve Bank. Litvinov was recalled in 1943 when the war turned in Russia's favor. His successor as foreign minister, Vyacheslav Molotov, provided an apt epitaph. Litvinov was utterly hostile to us. He deserves the highest measure of punishment at the hands of the proletariat. Every punishment. From the 1st to the 22nd of July, 1944, the international bankers organized a conference at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Its purpose was to establish a World Bank and an International Monetary Fund which would govern relations amongst independent nations and maintain fixed exchange rates. Soviet representatives attended the conference, but refused to sign, stating that the proposed institutions were branches of Wall Street. This impertinence of Stalin in all probability angered the Rothschilds, but there was little that they could do while Germany remained undefeated. Between the 17th of July and the 2nd of August, 1945, the Potsdam Conference was held in Germany. It determined the new borders of Europe. From this time, the Soviet Union was gradually frozen out and the start of the Cold War commenced. Stalin had no designs on Western Europe. His army was completely exhausted, and he had more than enough tasks on his hands in absorbing Eastern Europe under his hegemony and repairing all the damage to his country, which he had inflicted on himself by provoking Germany into starting a preventative war. From a military perspective, the dropping of alleged nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki was unnecessary, as in January 1945, Japan was already trying to secure surrender terms. The firebombing of these two cities served two more sinister purposes. 1. As a punishment to the Japanese for having set up their own state bank, and 2. As a warning to the Soviet Union, which also had a state bank. The Cold War was prosecuted, initially, by the Western countries in order to bring the Soviet Union to heel. Stalin, who was rather more of a nationalist than a communist, resisted and was allegedly poisoned and then allowed to die from a massive stroke for which he did not receive any medical treatment on the 1st of March 1953. Thereafter, the Cold War degenerated into a farce, as the West, and in particular the United States, invested heavily in the Soviet Union. Huge investments were made at the Gorky plant, which built Ford trucks, and the largest automotive plant in the world at Volgograd, which manufactured Fiat cars. There was also substantial investments in aviation, computers, and electricity. The Soviet Union became an investment destination of choice. The Russians soldiered on, but with 50% of their budget being allocated to armaments, this was a war which they could not win in the long term. This explains why living standards in the Soviet Union could never match those achieved in the West, notwithstanding the provision of free services such as education and housing. In 1991, the Soviet Union imploded and a swarm of advisors arrived from the USA, who introduced the wonders of unregulated free market capitalism, which included income tax and usury. The primary purpose of these advisors was to present the law on the Central Bank of Russia at the right moment, which hardly did less damage than a whole army of invaders in making Russia lose its sovereignty. For almost 200 years, the Tsars and Soviets resisted, but finally, Russia fell entirely into the hands of the Rothschilds. Rothschild's responsibility for the Anglo-Boer War. Throughout the 19th century, the world's monetary system was based on the gold standard, which had been developed and maintained by the Rothschilds. The discovery of the largest gold fields in the world on the Witwatersrand in 1886 created a new source of supply, which had to be controlled if this dishonest financial system was to survive. Unfortunately for the Rothschilds, these new mines were located in the independent Zuid-Afrikanische Republiek. Streams of immigrants and speculators soon arrived in the country. Some of them were British, but a larger number consisted of mostly Russian, Polish, and German Jews, with roving propensities and no strongly rooted attachment to an old country. The gold mine owners were almost entirely Jewish. The leading company was the Eckstein Group, named after its managing director, Hermann Eckstein. This combination included Consolidated Goldfields and South Neumann & Co. Professor John Atkinson Hobson writes in The War of South Africa, Its Causes and Effects, that Rothschild had a controlling interest in Goetz & Company, and that Rothschild stands for the Exploration Company, which is in effect Werner, Beit, and Rothschild. Furthermore, he adds that the dynamite monopoly and the rich and powerful liquor trade, licit and illicit, is entirely in the hands of the Jews. The stock exchange is, needless to say, mostly Jewish, and the press of Johannesburg is chiefly their property. By the early 1890s, the foreign workers and speculators had started to outnumber the Boers. In 1896, after the abortive Jameson raid, which tried to overthrow the Transvaal government, the South African League was founded as a Rothschild front in order to agitate for the granting of voting rights to the Uitlanders, or foreigners. In order to protect their status, the Boers would only grant the franchise after a period of 14 years of residence. On the 30th of May, 1899, at a conference held in Bloemfontein, the capital of the Orange Free State, President Paul Kruger offered to reduce the period of residence to 7 years. The British High Commissioner, Sir Alfred Milner, was unmoved and held to his point of view that it was reform or war. Eventually, Kruger, bowing his head between his big red hands, hot tears streaming down his bearded cheeks, cried out in anguish, "It is my country that you want." In September 1899, in an act of provocation, the British started to mass troops on the southern Transvaal border. A request on the 9th of October 1899 that Her Majesty's government cease the constant bringing up of troops to the borders of the Republic and the sending of reinforcements from all parts of the British Empire was ignored. 2 days later, war broke out. Although the Boers had only a part-time army of mounted horsemen, they enjoyed stunning successes in the initial phase of the war. However, they were ultimately outgunned, outnumbered, and in some instances, poorly led. From June 1900 onwards, the Boers resorted to guerrilla warfare. A tiny force of never more than 6,000 active Boers was able to frustrate and tie down almost 450,000 troops of the world's largest empire. Peace was signed at Vereeniging on the 31st of May, 1902. The war had been an unmitigated disaster for the Boers. In contravention of the Hague Convention of the 29th of July, 1899, which bound Great Britain to observe its rules of civilized warfare, an unprecedented scorched earth policy was introduced. The Boers' homesteads were razed to the ground, wells were poisoned, their cattle were slaughtered, and their women were raped. 25 towns and their contents and 20 villages, including all their churches, were destroyed. 155,000 women and children were herded into 46 concentration camps and housed in tents, where in some camps during winter temperatures fell below 0 degrees. 34,000 of them died of malnutrition, poor sanitation, and exposure, of whom 81% were under the age of 16. The British also suffered high losses, with 21,942 being killed, 35% in battle, 65% from disease, and 22,829 being wounded. The bankers had the satisfaction of obtaining full control of the gold and other mineral resources of South Africa, of financing the war in the amount of £222 million, and thereby adding a further £132 million to Britain's national debt. For Nathan, Alfred, and Leopold Rothschild, the Anglo-Boer War was a consummate victory. The Commonwealth Bank of Australia. The Commonwealth Bank of Australia was inspired by King O'Malley, an American, who found out the secrets of fractional reserve banking while working for his uncle's bank in New York in the 1880s. When the bank's first governor, Sir Denison Miller, was asked where he proposed obtaining capital for his bank, he replied, "What capital? I don't need any capital. My capital is the entire wealth and credit of the whole of Australia." With an advance of £10,000 from government, which was quickly repaid, the Commonwealth Bank of Australia was founded on the 15th of July, 1912. Although established as a private bank, it operated as a state bank, with the power to carry on all business generally transacted by banks, including that of a savings bank. Furthermore, the bank was entitled to raise capital through the sale of debentures secured by the national credit. Its profits were equally divided into two funds: a reserve fund to meet any liabilities incurred by the bank, and a redemption fund to redeem debentures or other stock issued by the bank. Thereafter, 50% of its profits were allocated for the liquidation of the national debt. For the next 12 years, notwithstanding the years of World War I, 1914 to 1918, Australia enjoyed one of its greatest eras of prosperity. By providing government loans at a nominal rate of interest, viz. 2/3 of 1% per annum, it enabled the country to embark on a huge infrastructure program. It included provision of $18.72 million Australian dollars for the construction of dams and the Murrumbidgee irrigation system, the Great Transcontinental Railroad, electricity power plants, gasworks, harbors, roads, and tramways. In addition, the fruit, wheat, and wool crops of farmers were financed for an amount of $3 million Australian dollars at nominal rates of interest. It made available $4 million Australian dollars to purchase 15 cargo steamers in order to transport Australia's growing exports, and $8 million Australian dollars were allocated to subsidized housing. World War I cost Australia $700 million Australian dollars, but it was financed by the bank as a non-interest-bearing debt. This phenomenal period of prosperity was terminated in 1924 when a bill, which placed control of the bank in the hands of a directorate consisting of a governor, the Secretary to the Treasury, and 6 persons actively engaged in agriculture, finance, and industry for different terms of years was introduced by Stanley Melbourne Bruce, Prime Minister 1924 to 1929, and Dr. Earl Page, his coalition partner. There is a suspicion that Bruce may have been bribed, as what he did was completely against the best interests of the Australian people. During his term of office, the Australian government borrowed £230 million from the City of London, and by 1927, the federal and state debt had reached £1 billion and the budget was in deficit. On the 10th of October, 1924, the bill was proclaimed as an act. The subsequent effect of this act was to place the bank under the control of a body of men who later deprived it of the right to create the nation's money supply free of debt and interest. In 1927, the bank lost its savings bank subsidiary, and although it was permitted to continue issuing banknotes and thereby earn a modicum of seigniorage, it thereafter became a central bank operating exclusively for the benefit of private banks. The final betrayal of the bank occurred on the 20th of March, 1947, when the House of Representatives voted by 55 to 5 votes for it to become a member of the International Monetary Fund and thus subject to the decrees and dictates of the Rothschild-controlled Bank for International Settlements. World War I. World War I started on the 28th of June, 1914, when Gavrilo Princip, allegedly of Jewish origin and a member of a terrorist group, the Black Hand, assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austrian throne, and his Czech-born wife at Sarajevo, Bosnia-Herzegovina. Princip was a collaborator of Leon Trotsky, real name Lev Davidovich Bronstein, a Russian Jew who was conspiring with a fellow Jew, Vladimir Lenin, named Ulyanov when adopted, real name Zetterbaum, to overthrow the Russian monarchy. He was in turn financed by an American Jew, Jacob Schiff, who was a frontman for an English Jew, Lord Nathan Rothschild, who was one of the masterminds behind this appalling catastrophe. These facts were confirmed in the United States Senate in 1921 when it was recorded that full responsibility for the First World War lies on the shoulders of the international Jewish bankers. They are responsible for millions of debt and dying. In late October 1926, further confirmation of these incontrovertible facts was revealed in a conversation between British parliamentarian Victor H. Cazalet and Henry Ford, 1863 to 1947. When the former asked who the international Jewish financiers were, Ford replied, "I have several books which will tell you who they all are. They were responsible for the last war and will in the future always be capable of creating a war when they feel their pockets need one." Trade rivalry, competing alliances, and misunderstood mobilizations are often proffered as being the primary causes of World War I. However, the real reasons in order of importance are as follows. 1. To destroy the Russian Empire and its state bank. 2. To break up the other empires, Austro-Hungarian, German, and Ottoman, into smaller states, which could then be exploited more efficiently through the establishment of central banks. 3. The theft of Palestine and the creation of a Zionist puppet state under the direct control of the Rothschilds. By the end of 1916, the British and French armies were in danger of losing the war, with the latter army having already mutinied on the Western Front. The British had lost their naval supremacy at the Battle of Jutland on the 3rd of May, 1916, when the German Navy, outnumbered by 2 to 1, humiliated the invincible Royal Navy, sinking 12 vessels for the loss of 6, and losing 2,551 sailors compared to the British loss of 6,094. Both Kaisers were desperate to bring an end to this fratricidal and pointless slaughter. Seemingly out of the blue came an offer from Lord Rothschild to secure American intervention in return for handing over Palestine to a group of Jewish Zionists after the liquidation of the Ottoman Empire. On the 6th of April, 1917, the United States declared war on Germany and the other Central Powers, and on the 2nd of November, 1917, Lord Rothschild and his Zionist collaborators received their written understanding by Great Britain to eventually hand over Palestine to Jewish settlers. This infamous document, known as the Balfour Declaration, was drafted by Lord Arthur James Balfour, British Foreign Secretary, and General Jan Christian Smuts, a member of the Imperial War Cabinet. The misery of this unnecessary war dragged on for another 2 years. Russia was totally destroyed, and an insoluble problem was created in the Middle East. As Rabbi Reichhorn prophetically remarked in 1859, "Wars are the Jews' harvest, for with them we wipe out the Christians and get control of their gold. We have already killed 100 million of them. We shall drive the Christians into war by exploiting their national vanity and stupidity. They will then massacre each other, thus giving room for our own people." In similar vein, Gutli Schnapper, Mayor Amschel Rothschild's wife, is reputed to have said shortly before she died in 1849, "If my sons did not want war, there would have been none." An armistice was declared on the 11th of November, 1918, and 7 months later, on the 28th of June, 1919, the deeply flawed Treaty of Versailles was signed. Germany had to accept exclusive blame and pay extortionate reparations of £6.6 billion, equivalent to the entire wealth of the country, even though the other principal belligerents, England, France, and Russia, were equally, if not more, blameworthy. This indemnity would be used to repay the international bankers the fraudulent loans and interest which had been previously lent to the governments of Great Britain and France. As General Smuts said at the conference, "Everything we have done here is far worse than the Congress of Vienna. The statesmen of 1815 at least knew what was going on. Our statesmen have no idea." A History of Central Banking and the Enslavement of Mankind by Stephen Mitford Goodson. Chapter 5. The Great Depression. Capital must protect itself in every possible way, both by combination and legislation. Debts must be collected, mortgages foreclosed as rapidly as possible. When, through process of law, the common people lose their homes, they will become more docile and more easily governed through the strong arm of the government applied by a central power of wealth under leading financiers. These truths are well known among our principal men, who are now engaged in forming an imperialism to govern the world. By dividing the voters through the political party system, we can get them to expend their energies in fighting for questions of no importance. It is thus, by discreet action, we can ensure for ourselves that which has been so well planned and so successfully accomplished. Montague Norman, Governor of the Bank of England, addressing the United States Bankers Association, New York, Idaho Leader, 26th of August, 1924. By the turn of the 20th century, there were still only 18 central banks: Swedish Riksbank, 1668, Bank of England, 1694, Banco de España, 1782, Banque de France, 1800, Bank of Finland, 1812, De Nederlandische Bank, 1814, Norges Bank, 1816, Österreichische National Bank, 1816, Danmarks National Bank, 1818, Banco de Portugal, 1846, National Bank of Belgium, 1850, Bank Indonesia, formerly Java Bank, 1828, German Reichsbank, 1876, Bulgarian National Bank, 1879, National Bank of Romania, 1880, Bank of Japan, 1882, National Bank of Serbia, 1884, and the Banca d'Italia, 1893. In 1922, a conference was held in Genoa from the 10th of April to the 19th of May and attended by heads of state, governors of the Bank of England, Banque de France, and the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and a host of other international bankers. At this conference, it was resolved to set up central banks in all countries where they were not in existence. The governor of the Bank of England, Montague Norman, insisted that the central banks should be independent of their governments. A. N. Field, in All These Things, summarizes this significant occasion as follows. Despite the audacity of these proceedings, they were entirely successful. The paid economists duly discovered that reserve banks were marvelous scientific improvements. The newspapers joined in the chorus of applause, and the politicians of the various states behaved as so many bellwethers leading the sheep to the slaughterhouse. The fact was entirely overlooked that the financiers are in no sense public servants, but simply the paid agents of the shareholders in a banking company whose interests need not in the least be identical with the national interest. The Bank for International Settlements. The number of new central banks increased, particularly after the establishment of the Bank for International Settlements at Basel early in 1930, when central reserve banks, more or less independent of the governments of the countries in which they were situated, sprang up like mushrooms all over the world amid a chorus of approval from deluded governments and people whom these banks were intended to reduce to servitude. The original purpose of the BIS was to facilitate German reparations payments in terms of the Treaty of Versailles. But once the artificially contrived Great Depression started to take effect and the National Socialists assumed power in January 1933, all payments ceased and the BIS had to find a new direction, viz., the fostering of monetary cooperation. In reality, the BIS guides and directs the centrally planned global financial system through the central banks of each country, of which 60 are affiliated to it. The headquarters of the bank are in Basel, Switzerland, and they are currently housed in an ugly 18-story building which looks like the cooling tower of a power station. It is an unelected, unaccountable central bank of the central bankers, which has complete immunity from national laws and taxation, and has its own private police force. Furthermore, in terms of rights granted by an agreement with the Swiss Federal Council, all of the bank's archives, documents, and electronic data are inviolable at all times and in all places. This agreement dates back to Article 10 of Paragraph 2 of the Hague Protocol, which was signed on the 31st of August 1929, and states that the bank, its property and assets, and also the deposits of other funds entrusted to it on the territory of or dependent on the administration of shall be immune from any disabilities and from any restrictive measures such as censorship, requisition, seizure, or confiscation in time of peace or war, reprisals, prohibition or restriction of export of gold or currency and other similar interferences, restrictions, or prohibitions. Bi-monthly meetings, where the global economy is discussed, are held in absolute secrecy. There is no written agenda unless one of the statutes of the bank requires revision, and minutes are not kept. The principal functions of the bank are ostensibly 1. Facilitating collaboration amongst central banks by means of accords. 2. Promoting financial stability. 3. Research on policy issues. 4. Acting as a counterparty for central banks in their financial transactions. 5. Serving as an agent or trustee in connection with international financial operations. However, the true nature of the BIS was revealed in the book Tragedy and Hope, written by insider Professor Carroll Quigley of Georgetown University, who wrote as follows. In addition to these pragmatic goals, the powers of financial capitalism had another far-reaching aim, nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. This system was to be controlled in a feudalist fashion by the central banks of the world acting in concert, by secret agreements arrived at in frequent private meetings and conferences. The apex of the system was to be the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland, a private bank owned and controlled by the world's central banks, which were themselves private corporations. Each central bank, in the hands of men like Montague Norman of the Bank of England, Benjamin Strong of the New York Federal Reserve Bank, Charles Rist of the Bank of France, and Hjalmar Schacht of the Reichsbank, sought to dominate its government by its ability to control treasury loans, to manipulate foreign exchanges, to influence the level of economic activity in the country, and to influence cooperative politicians by subsequent economic rewards in the business world. As Professor Quigley predicted back in 1966, the ultimate aim of the BIS is a single world currency, a one world economic system, and a global government, where national laws are no longer applicable or relevant. Control of the bank lies with the House of Rothschild through its investments in various central and private banks. After World War II and the dissolution of the European colonial empires, because they were no longer financially sustainable and offered far greater prospects for exploitation and plunder by means of international loans, there was a further proliferation of central banks, and currently their number stands at 157. 8 of these banks are in private ownership: National Bank of Belgium, Bank of Greece, Banca d'Italia, Bank of Japan, South African Reserve Bank, Swiss National Bank, Central Bank of the Republic of Turkey, and the United States Federal Reserve Bank. The coordinated establishment of all these central banks proves beyond doubt that they are part of an international money trust. United States Federal Reserve Bank. Between 1820 and 1910, although there was a temporary spike in prices during the American Civil War, 1861 to 1865, the dollar retained its purchasing power, viz. $1 was still worth $1 90 years later. However, it took a mere 6 years for the U.S. Federal Reserve Bank to destroy the value of the dollar. Between 1914 and 1920, prices rose by 125%, reducing its value by 56.1%. Before casting our attention to the Great Depression, a brief examination of the causes of the first major deflation needs to be considered. In order to rein in prices, a secret bankers' meeting was held on the 18th of May, 1920, in Washington, D.C., under the misleading title of the Orderly Deflation Committee of the American Bankers Association. Under orders of the Federal Reserve Board, without notice or warning, the discount rate rose rapidly from 2% to 9% and beyond. Simultaneously, the Federal Reserve Bank began aggressively to sell government bonds, reducing their value by 20%. The fall in bond prices reduced the value of the reserves of the community banks, which were forced to call in all their loans. This resulted in a terrific liquidation of all agricultural products, and agricultural prices tumbled to ruinously low levels. At the same time, freight companies, owned by the major trusts such as the Harrimans, increased their railroad rates to such an extent that in some states, freight costs exceeded the costs of farm production. The Farm Product Index dropped by more than half, from 244 in May 1920 to 117 a year later. Many farmers were ruined as their overheads remained unchanged and their financial costs soared. The unlimited powers which the Federal Reserve Bank possessed had enabled it to contract the currency and credit of the United States by $2 billion, with the result that prices were cut in half and confusion and distress reigned. This policy was carried out with deliberate intent in order to impoverish the agricultural sector by transferring rural money to the urban centers and at the same time reducing America's food independence, thereby making it vulnerable to the intrigues and whims of financial speculators and swindlers. In July 1921, the Federal Reserve Bank reversed this policy by repurchasing government bonds. However, the damage done to agricultural banks could not be repaired, and agricultural products remained artificially depressed, with some products being sold below the cost of production. In August 1927, the conspirators running the privately owned Federal Reserve Bank decided that it was time to create a new boom. Despite the protestations of 11 of the 12 Federal Reserve Banks, who perceived the danger, they were ordered to lower their rediscount rates and embark on a massive government bond repurchasing program, the modern equivalent of quantitative easing, to boost the money supply. Hardly any of this newly created money ex nihilo went into productive investments, but was poured into the stock market, where the price-to-earnings ratio quickly rose to 20, and in some cases to 50. The news media and deluded economists announced the arrival of a new era of permanent prosperity and purposefully fanned the flames of speculation, as 16 million Americans out of an adult population of 73 million bought and sold shares. On the 9th of March 1929, Paul Warburg, Freemason and founder of the Federal Reserve Bank, advised all member banks, as well as Secretary of the Treasury and fellow Mason Andrew Mellon, to get out of the stock market or sell it short. He informed them that if they acted immediately, they would reap enormous profits, as the Dow Jones share index was about to collapse in a titanic plunge. On the 24th of October, 1929, the Federal Reserve Bank decided to put an end to this orgy of speculation and to commence the fleecing of the people. The rediscount rate was suddenly increased to 6%. From nowhere, thousands of orders arrived at the New York Stock Exchange to sell at market, a typical stratagem employed by speculators to knock down share prices rapidly. Confidence soon evaporated, and the first intentionally planned Great Depression was in full swing. The decisive point came 6 days later, on the 30th of October, 1929, when the Federal Reserve Bank ordered the contraction of brokers' loans in the amount of $2.3 million. The stock exchange went into a tailspin, and by December 1932, the value of its listed securities had fallen by 83.1%, from $89 billion to $15 billion. The economic and social consequences of this implosion were devastating. Out of 24,000 banks, 10,000 were crushed out of existence, leaving their depositors ruined. 200,000 companies filed for bankruptcy, and 8.3 million people were thrown onto the streets. Within 3 years, 24.9% of the working population was unemployed. The total national income of the United States declined by 40.7%, from $81 billion in 1927 to $48 billion in 1932. During the Depression years, an estimated 3 million people died of starvation. The main causes were malnutrition, infectious diseases, starvation, and suicide. When referring to the New York Stock Exchange collapse, which initiated the Depression, Congressman Louis T. McFadden stated with precision, "It was a carefully contrived occurrence. The international bankers sought to bring about a condition of despair so that they might emerge as the rulers of us all." A. N. Field condemned the worthlessness of central banks and the perverted purposes for which they had been consistently utilized as follows. Reserve banking as a means of preventing financial crises has thus been a most complete and total failure in the United States. This fact has in no way mitigated against a world campaign to establish reserve banks in all countries. It has been alleged that the financiers in command of the United States Federal Reserve do not want stable conditions, and that the unprecedented booms and slumps since its establishment have been deliberately caused. It is at least certain that those in control of the system have raised the strongest objections to every one of the numerous attempts made in Congress to write an instruction into the law directing the Federal Reserve to use its tremendous powers to maintain the purchasing power of its money at a stable level. In a newspaper article in the Financial Times written in 1930, Professor Carl Gustav Kassel of Stockholm University, Sweden, remarked, "Practically absolute power over the welfare of the world has been placed in the hands of the Federal Reserve Board, and one is appalled to see the apparently haphazard manner in which the board uses this power, how ignorant it is of the aim which ought to dictate American monetary policy." Finally, in this section, we may pause to reflect on a thunderous speech given on Friday, the 10th of June, 1932, in the United States House of Representatives by the former chairman of the House Banking and Currency Committee, 1920 to 1931, the Honorable Louis T. McFadden. "Mr. Chairman, we have in this country one of the most corrupt institutions the world has ever known. I refer to the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve Banks. The Federal Reserve Board, a government board, has cheated the government of the United States and the people of the United States out of enough money to pay the national debt. The depredations and the iniquities of the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve banks acting together have cost this country enough money to pay the national debt several times over. This evil institution has impoverished and ruined the people of the United States, has bankrupted itself, and has practically bankrupted our government. It has done this through the defects of the law under which it operates, through the maladministration of that law by the Federal Reserve Board, and through the corrupt practices of the moneyed vultures who control it. Some people think the Federal Reserve banks are United States government institutions. They are not government institutions. They are private credit monopolies which prey upon the people of the United States for the benefit of themselves and their foreign customers, foreign and domestic speculators and swindlers, and rich and predatory moneylenders. In that dark crew of financial pirates, there are those who would cut a man's throat to get $1 out of his pocket. There are those who send money into the states to buy votes to control our legislation. And there are those who maintain international propaganda for the purpose of deceiving us and of wheedling us into the granting of new concessions which will permit them to cover up their past misdeeds and set again in motion their gigantic train of crime. Those 12 private credit monopolies were deceitfully and disloyally foisted upon this country by bankers who came here from Europe and who repaid us for our hospitality by undermining our American institutions. Those bankers took money out of this country to finance Japan in a war against Russia. They created a reign of terror in Russia with our money in order to help that war along, instigated the separate peace between Germany and Russia, and thus drove a wedge between the Allies in the World War. They financed Trotsky's mass meetings of discontent and rebellion in New York. They paid Trotsky's passage from New York to Russia so that he might assist in the destruction of the Russian Empire. They fomented and instigated the Russian Revolution, and they placed a large fund of American dollars at Trotsky's disposal in one of their branch banks in Sweden, so that through him, Russian homes might be thoroughly broken up and Russian children flung far and wide from their natural protectors. They have since begun the breaking up of American homes and the dispersal of American children. It has been said that President Wilson was deceived by the attentions of these bankers and by the philanthropic poses they assumed. It has been said that when he discovered the manner in which he had been misled by Colonel House, he turned against that busybody, that holy monk of the financial empire, and showed him the door. He had the grace to do that, and in my opinion, he deserves great credit for it. President Wilson died a victim of deception. When he came to the presidency, he had certain qualities of mind and heart which entitled him to a high place in the councils of this nation. But there was one thing he was not and which he never aspired to be. He was not a banker. He said that he knew very little about banking. It was, therefore, on the advice of others that the iniquitous Federal Reserve Act, the death warrant of American liberty, became law in his administration. Mr. Chairman, there should be no partisanship in matters concerning the banking and currency affairs of this country, and I do not speak with any. In 1912, the National Monetary Association, under the chairmanship of the late Senator Nelson W. Aldrich, made a report and presented a vicious bill called the National Reserve Association Bill. This bill is usually spoken of as the Aldrich Bill. Senator Aldrich did not write the Aldrich Bill. He was the tool, but not the accomplice, of the European-born Jewish bankers who for nearly 20 years had been scheming to set up a central bank in this country, and who, in 1912, had spent and were continuing to spend vast sums of money to accomplish their purpose. The Aldrich Bill was condemned in the platform upon which Theodore Roosevelt was nominated in the year 1912, and in that same year, when Woodrow Wilson was nominated, the Democratic platform, as adopted at the Biltmore Convention, expressly stated, "We are opposed to the Aldrich Plan or a central bank." This was plain language. The men who ruled the Democratic Party then promised the people that if they were returned to power, there would be no central bank established here while they held the reins of government. 13 months later, that promise was broken, and the Wilson administration, under the tutelage of those sinister Wall Street figures who stood behind Colonel House, established here in our free country the worm-eaten monarchical institution of the King's Bank to control us from the top downward and to shackle us from the cradle to the grave. The Federal Reserve Act destroyed our old and characteristic way of doing business. It discriminated against our one-name commercial paper, the finest in the world. It set up the antiquated two-name paper, which is the present curse of this country, and which has wrecked every country which has ever given it scope. It fastened down upon this country the very tyranny from which the framers of the Constitution sought to save us. One of the greatest battles for the preservation of this republic was fought out here in Jackson's day, when the Second Bank of the United States, which was founded upon the same false principles as those which are exemplified in the Federal Reserve Act, was hurled out of existence. After the downfall of the Second Bank of the United States in 1837, the country was warned against the dangers that might ensue if the predatory interests, after being cast out, should come back in disguise and unite themselves to the executive, and through him acquire control of the government. That is what the predatory interests did when they came back in the livery of hypocrisy and under false pretenses obtained the passage of the Federal Reserve Act. The danger that the country was warned against came upon us and is shown in the long train of horrors attendant upon the affairs of the traitorous and dishonest Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve Banks. Look around you when you leave this chamber, and you will see evidences of it on all sides. This is an era of economic misery, and for the conditions that caused that misery, the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve Banks are fully liable. This is an era of financed crime, and in the financing of crime, the Federal Reserve Board does not play the part of a disinterested spectator. The people of the United States are being greatly wronged. If they are not, then I do not know what wronging the people means. They have been driven from their employments. They have been dispossessed of their homes. They have been evicted from their rented quarters. They have lost their children. They have been left to suffer and to die for the lack of shelter, food, clothing, and medicine. The wealth of the United States and the working capital of the United States has been taken away from them and has either been locked in the vaults of certain banks and great corporations or exported to foreign countries for the benefit of the foreign customers of those banks and corporations. So far as the people of the United States are concerned, the cupboard is bare. It is true that the warehouses and coal yards and grain elevators are full, but the warehouses and coal yards and grain elevators are padlocked, and the great banks and corporations hold the keys. The sack of the United States by the Federal Reserve Board and Federal Reserve Banks and their confederates is the greatest crime in history. Mr. Chairman, a serious situation confronts the House of Representatives today. We are the trustees of the people, and the rights of the people are being taken away from them. Through the Federal Reserve Board and the Federal Reserve Banks, the people are losing the rights guaranteed to them by the Constitution. Their property has been taken from them without due process of law. Mr. Chairman, common decency requires us to examine the public accounts of the government to see what crimes against the public welfare have been or are being committed. What is needed here is a return to the Constitution of the United States. We need to have complete divorce of bank and state. The old struggle that was fought out here in Jackson's day must be fought over again. The independent United States Treasury should be reestablished, and the government should keep its own money under lock and key in the building the people provided for that purpose. Asset currency, the device of the swindler, should be done away with. The government should buy gold and issue United States currency on it. The business of the independent bankers should be restored to them. The state banking system should be freed from coercion. The Federal Reserve District should be abolished, and state boundaries should be respected. Bank reserves should be kept within the borders of the states whose people own them, and this reserve money of the people should be protected so that international bankers and acceptance bankers and discount dealers cannot draw it away from them. The exchanges should be closed while we are putting our financial affairs in order. The Federal Reserve Act and the Federal Reserve Banks, having violated their charters, should be liquidated immediately. Faithless government officers who have violated their oaths of office should be impeached and brought to trial. Unless this is done by us, I predict that the American people, outraged, mobbed, pillaged, insulted, and betrayed as they are in their own land, will rise in their wrath and send a president here who will sweep the money changers out of the temple. From the above speech, it may be noted that the concerns raised by the Labour Party in South Africa during the debate on the South African Banking and Currency Bill that what had been done in the USA was not in the interests of the public but of the banks were fully justified. That the naive and foolish legislators of 1920 allowed the South African Reserve Bank to be established as a replication of the U.S. Federal Reserve Bank, which Congressman McFadden described as being one of the most corrupt and evil institutions in the world, is a matter of deep regret and must be censured in the strongest terms. Clifford Hugh Douglas. Clifford Hugh Douglas, 1879 to 1952, was an engineer who, while working as an assistant superintendent at the Royal Aircraft Factory in Farnborough, England during World War I, noticed that the total cost of goods were greater than the sums paid in lieu of wages, salaries, and dividends. He decided to investigate this disconnect in the way money flowed through industry, and, after collecting data from hundreds of companies, found that there was a persistent deficit in purchasing power of consumers relative to total costs of production. He considered income tax to be a negative dividend and instead proposed the payment of a national dividend to all citizens, which would bridge the gap between earnings and prices. This dividend would provide consumers with the additional buying power necessary to absorb all the current production of goods in a non-inflationary manner. This forms part of Douglas's A plus B theorem, viz., that prices are always being generated at a faster rate than incomes are produced, so that the total prices of all goods in the economy at any particular stage exceed the total buying power of consumers. Douglas's economic theory, known as social credit, advocated the transfer of the money creation process from private banks, which create money out of nothing as an interest-bearing debt, to a state bank. He also proposed a price adjustment mechanism called the just price. This mechanism would reduce prices by a percentage as a consequence of physical efficiencies introduced into the production process through improvements in technology. In this manner, the benefits of technology would flow directly to the workers and increase their standard of living. Douglas was very aware of the fact that these increasing technological advances would make the attainment of full employment an impossibility. Hence, his insistence on the payment of a national dividend, which was calculated by adding to a basic income the increase in national production and consumption data. After World War I, Douglas devoted the rest of his life to the promotion of his ideas and gave lectures in many countries, including Australia, Canada, Japan, New Zealand, and Norway. He achieved two notable successes. 1. The Social Credit Party obtained control of the provincial government of Alberta, Canada, in 1935. 2. After a lecture tour in Japan in 1929, his policies were adopted by the Japanese government in 1932. Douglas's policies were very much feared by the international bankers, and in the 1930s, they put up a very considerable sum of £5 million in order to counter his highly successful program of public enlightenment. Douglas had nothing but disdain for central banking, and, on one occasion, while delivering a speech in Newcastle upon Tyne in 1937, he described the Bank of England as being a mental institution. Irving Norton Fisher. Irving Fisher, 1867 to 1947, was a famous professor of economics at Yale University who adopted a mathematical approach to resolving economic problems. He is well known for his utility theory, which juxtaposed the measurability of the utility function to demand theory. In his treatise, The Theory of Interest, he observed the changes in the value of goods relative to changes in time and interest rates. This later became known as the quantity theory of money. Throughout his life, he was active in the eugenics movement. In March 1913, Senator Robert L. Owen, chairman of the Senate Banking Committee, tried to introduce an alternative bill to the fraudulent Rothschild-Rockefeller banking and currency proposal. The bill would have allowed for the inclusion of staple commodities as part of the monetary base, in addition to gold and silver, and would thereby have prevented the possibility of either inflation or deflation, and would have created true freedom of employment. Irving Fisher assisted Owen in the drafting of this bill, but was subsequently blackmailed into withdrawing his support. The following illuminating paragraph, extracted from Emanuel Josephson's The Federal Reserve Conspiracy and Rockefeller, Their Gold Corner, describes what transpired. The conspirators determined to block the adoption of the Owen Bill. They had Professor Fisher summoned before the Yale officials and confronted with the charge that he was so foolish as to advocate money based on commodities other than gold. He was warned, related Senator Owen, that there would be no place at Yale, or in any other university, for anyone so foolish. Professor Fisher was keenly aware of the side on which his bread was buttered, and was no more principled, unfortunately, than are the multitude of professors prostituted to the conspirators and their foundations. He succumbed to the conspirators' blackmail, double-crossed Senator Owen, and withdrew his professional support of the honest remedial bill that he had helped draft. In its place, Professor Fisher announced his advocacy of what he mockingly labeled a commodity dollar, the value of which was to be determined by a gold index that would block stabilization of the economy by making speculative the value of commodities, of gold and of the dollar, and would enhance the power of the conspirators to manipulate or manage the economy to enable them more readily to swindle the nation. The coup de grace was given to Senator Owen's honest, stabilizing currency and banking bill by its flat and categoric rejection by President Wilson. Having relented after his previous betrayal of Senator Owen's efforts to amend the currency and banking bill, in 1920, Fisher published a book, Dollar Stabilization, which contained what later became known as the Chicago Plan. The plan was privately issued as a 6-page memorandum and distributed to 40 individuals on the 16th of March, 1933. It advocated that the state should create the nation's money supply and that private banks should operate as full reserve banks. Using mathematical principles, Fisher was able to prove that full employment would be the result, business cycles would be abolished, and inflation would be reduced and remain at zero. In August 2012, two researchers at the International Monetary Fund, Jeremy Benz and Michael Kumhoff, produced the Chicago Plan Revisited. They found that every one of Fisher's findings was 100% correct. Their conclusion is cited in full. This paper revisits the Chicago Plan, a proposal for fundamental monetary reform that was put forward by many leading U.S. economists at the height of the Great Depression. Fisher, 1936, in his brilliant summary of the Chicago Plan, claims that it had four major advantages, ranging from greater macroeconomic stability to much lower debt levels throughout the economy. In this paper, we were able rigorously to evaluate his claims by applying the recommendations of the Chicago Plan to a state-of-the-art monetary DSGE model that contains a fully microfunded and carefully calibrated model of the current U.S. financial system. The critical feature of this model is that the economy's money supply is created by banks through debt, rather than being created debt-free by the government. Our analytical and simulation results fully validate Fisher's claims. The Chicago Plan could significantly reduce business cycle volatility caused by rapid changes in banks' attitudes towards credit risk. It would eliminate bank runs, and it would lead to an instantaneous and large reduction in the levels of both government and private debt. It would accomplish the latter by making government-issued money, which represents equity in the Commonwealth rather than debt, the central liquid asset of the economy, while banks concentrate on their strength, the extension of credit to investment projects that require monitoring and risk management expertise. We find that the advantages of the Chicago Plan go even beyond those claimed by Fisher. One additional advantage is large, steady-state output gains due to the removal or reduction of multiple distortions, including interest rate risk spreads, distortionary taxes, and costly monitoring of macroeconomically unnecessary risks. Another advantage is the ability to drive steady-state inflation to zero in an environment where liquidity traps do not exist, and where monetarism becomes feasible and desirable because the government does in fact control broad monetary aggregates. This ability to generate and live with zero steady-state inflation is an important result because it answers the somewhat confused claim of opponents of an exclusive government monopoly on money issuance, namely that such a monetary system would be highly inflationary. There is nothing in our theoretical framework to support this claim, and, as discussed in Section 2, there is very little in the monetary history of ancient societies and Western nations to support it either. A History of Central Banking and the Enslavement of Mankind, by Stephen Mitford Goodson. Chapter 6, The Rise and Fall of State Banking, 1932 to 1945. You are aware that the gold standard has been the ruin of the states which adopted it, for it has not been able to satisfy the demands for money, the more so that we have removed gold from circulation as far as possible. Protocol number 20. I next argued that the gold standard, the fixing of rates of exchange and so forth, were shibboleths which I had never regarded and never would regard as weighty and immutable principles of economy. Money, to me, was simply a token of exchange for work done, and its value depended absolutely on the value of the work accomplished. Where money did not represent services rendered, I insisted it had no value at all. Adolf Hitler. Reichsbank, the state bank of National Socialist Germany. Out of the worldwide chaos and economic havoc of the 1930s, which had been induced by the Rothschild-controlled/owned central banks, three phoenixes would arise. In May 1919, an insignificant soldier attended a lecture given by a former construction engineer turned economist, Dr. Gottfried Feder, 1883 to 1941, entitled The Abolition of Interest Servitude. The purpose of this course of lectures was to provide the soldiers with a background in politics and economics, which would enable them to monitor the many revolutionary and political movements active in Munich at that time. The following quotations taken from Mein Kampf reveal the decisive influence that Feder would have on Adolf Hitler's thinking. For the first time in my life, I heard a discussion which dealt with the principles of stock exchange capital and capital which was used for loan activities. After hearing the first lecture delivered by Feder, the idea immediately came into my head that I had found a way to one of the most essential prerequisites for the founding of a new party. To my mind, Feder's merit consisted in the ruthless and trenchant way in which he describes the double character of the capital engaged in stock exchange and loan transactions, laying bare the fact that this capital is ever and always dependent on the payment of interest. In the fundamental questions, his statements were so full of common sense that those who criticized him did not deny au fond that his ideas were sound, but they doubted whether it be possible to put these ideas into practice. To me, this seemed the strongest point in Feder's teaching, though others considered it a weak point. And again, I understood immediately that here was a truth of transcendental importance for the future of the German people. The absolute separation of stock exchange capital from the economic life of the nation would make it possible to oppose the process of internationalization in German business without at the same time attacking capital as such. For to do this would be to jeopardize the foundations of our national independence. I clearly saw what was developing in Germany, and I realized that the stiffest fight we would have to wage would not be against the enemy nations, but against international capital. In Feder's speech, I found an effective rallying cry for our coming struggle. A few weeks later, Hitler received an instruction from his military superiors to investigate a political association called the Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, German Workers' Party. At this meeting, held on the 12th of September 1919 in the Sternecker Brau Inn in Munich, about 20 to 25 persons were present. The main speaker was Gottfried Feder. Shortly thereafter, Hitler joined this party and received a provisional certificate of membership numbering 7. His first act on assuming control of the party was to rename it the Nationalsozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, National Socialist German Workers' Party. Feder, who was the principal drafter of the party's 25 points, became the architect and theoretician of the program. In July 1933, he was appointed Under-Secretary of State for Economic Affairs and in 1934, Reichskommissar, Reich Commissioner. Monetary reform was the very essence of National Socialism, as is revealed in the following extracts taken from The Program of the NSDAP, the National Socialist German Workers' Party and its General Conceptions, published in Munich in 1932. Adolf Hitler prints its 2 main points in leaded type: the common interest before self, the spirit of the program; abolition of the thraldom of interest, the core of National Socialism. Once these 2 points are achieved, it means a victory of their approaching universalist ordering of society in the true state over the present-day separation of state, nation, and economics under the corrupting influence of the individualist theory of society as now constructed. The sham state of today, oppressing the working classes and protecting the pirated gains of bankers and stock exchange speculators, is the area for reckless private enrichment and for the lowest political profiteering. It gives no thought to its people and provides no high moral bond of union. The power of money, most ruthless of all powers, holds absolute control and exercises corrupting, destroying influence on state, nation, society, morals, drama, literature, and on all matters of morality less easy to estimate. Break down the thraldom of interest is our war cry. What do we mean by the thraldom of interest? The landowner is under this thraldom, who has to raise loans to finance his farming operations, loans at such high interest as almost to eat up the results of his labor, or who is forced to make debts and to drag the mortgages after him like so much lead. So is the worker, producing in shops and factories for a pittance, while the shareholder draws dividends and bonuses which he has not worked for. So is the earning middle class, whose work goes almost entirely to pay the interest on bank overdrafts. Thraldom of interest is the real expression for the antagonisms, capital versus labor, blood versus money, creative work versus exploitation. The necessity of breaking this thraldom is of such vast importance for our nation and our race that on it alone depends our nation's hope of rising up from its shame and slavery. In fact, the hope of recovering happiness, prosperity, and civilization throughout the world. It is the pivot on which everything turns. It is far more than mere necessity of financial policy. Whilst its principles and consequences bite deep into political and economic life, it is a leading question for economic study, and thus affects every single individual and demands a decision from each one: service to the nation or unlimited private enrichment. It means a solution of the social question. Our financial principle: finance shall exist for the benefit of the state. The financial magnates shall not form a state within the state. Hence our aim to break the thraldom of interest. Relief of the state, and hence of the nation, from its indebtedness to the great financial houses, which lend on interest. Nationalization of the Reichsbank and the issuing houses, which lend on interest. Provision of money for all great public objects, water power, railroads, etc., not by means of loans, but by granting non-interest-bearing state bonds and without using ready money. Introduction of a fixed standard of currency on a secured basis. Creation of a National Bank of Business Development currency reform for granting non-interest-bearing loans. Fundamental remodeling of the system of taxation on socio-economic principles. Relief of the consumer from the burden of indirect taxation, and of the producer from crippling taxation, fiscal reform, and relief from taxation. Wanton printing of banknotes, without creating new values, means inflation. We all lived through it. But the correct conclusion is that an issue of non-interest-bearing bonds by the state cannot produce inflation if new values are at the same time created. The fact that today great economic enterprises cannot be set on foot without recourse to loans is sheer lunacy. Here is where reasonable use of the state's right to produce money which might produce most beneficial results. On the 30th of January 1933, the National Socialists were swept to power by means of a coalition or Regierung der nationalen Konzentration, Government of National Concentration, with the Deutsche Nationale Volkspartei, German National People's Party. A somewhat attenuated version of monetary reform was introduced. In order to finance the state's work in rearmament programs, two dummy corporations called Gesellschaft für öffentliche Arbeiten (OFA) and Metallforschungsgesellschaft (MEFO) were established. These corporations accepted bills of exchange from suppliers who fulfilled state orders. These bills of exchange were then discounted at the Reichsbank at a rate of 4%. They were issued for 3 months only, which was clearly unsatisfactory in view of the long-term nature of the various projects they were financing. They could, however, be extended at 3 monthly intervals for up to 5 years. In January 1939, matters came to a head when the president of the Reichsbank, Hjalmar Schacht, refused extension of 3 billion Reichsmarks worth of OFA and MEFO bills because of fears of inflation. On the 7th of January 1939, Schacht sent Hitler a memorandum signed by himself and the 8 other board members of the Reichsbank, which contained the following main points. 1. The Reich must spend only that amount covered by taxes. 2. Full financial control must be returned to the Ministry of Finance, then forced to pay for anything the army desired. 3. Price and wage control must be rendered effective. The existing mismanagement must be eliminated. 4. The use of money and investment markets must be at the sole discretion of the Reichsbank. This meant a practical elimination of Göring's 4-year plan. Schacht concluded his memorandum with the ambiguous words, "We shall be happy to do our best to collaborate with all future goals, but for now, the time has come to call a halt." By these means, Schacht intended to collapse the German economy, which during the period of 1933 to 1939 had increased its gross national product by 100%. From being a ruined and bankrupt nation in January 1933, with 7.5 million unemployed persons, Hitler had transformed Germany into a modern socialist paradise. He was justifiably angry and rejected the recommendations of the Reichsbank as mutiny. 2 weeks later, Schacht was sacked. Roger Ellison described this momentous event as follows. On the 19th of January 1939, Schacht was summarily dismissed, and the Reichsbank was ordered to grant the Reich all credits requested by Hitler. This decisive action essentially emasculated both the Reichsbank's control over domestic monetary policy and the German power base of international Jewry. It had the effect of removing from Jewish bankers the power to deflate and destroy the German economy. Excluding the implications of the interest rate paid on the MEFO bills, Germany could now be viewed as being on a Feder system rather than a Schacht system. The Reichsbank effectively became an arm of the government, with the only real change being in the fact that bills were now monetized or discounted under the auspices of the state rather than some Jewish lackey in the Reichsbank presidency. Thus, only in January 1939 did the Reichsbank become an authentic state bank. Schacht's dismissal also terminated the transfer of confidential information regarding all of Germany's economic developments, which he had been deviously giving without interruption to Montague Norman, a fellow Mason and governor of the Bank of England, 1920 to 1944. A new Reichsbank law, which was promulgated on the 15th of June 1939, made the bank unconditionally subordinated to the sovereignty of the state. Article 3 of the law decreed that the bank, renamed the Deutsche Reichsbank, should be directed and managed according to the instructions and under the supervision of the Führer and Reichschancellor. Hitler was now his own banker, but having departed from the fold of international swindlers and usurers, he would, like Napoleon Bonaparte, who in 1800 had established the Banque de France as a state bank, suffer the same fate, an unnecessary war followed by the ruination of his people and country. It was this event which triggered World War II, the realization by the Rothschilds that universal replication of Germany's usury-free state banking system would permanently destroy their evil financial empire. In order to provide the Poles with a free hand, which would enable them to antagonize and provoke the Germans, a deceitful and worthless offer to guarantee Poland sovereignty was given by Great Britain on the 31st of March 1939. During the next 5 months, the Polish government progressively intensified the oppression, harassment of, and attacks on the remaining 1.5 million ethnic Germans living in Poland. These attacks, in which over 58,000 German civilians were killed by Poles in acts of wanton savagery, culminated in the Bromberg massacre on the 3rd of September 1939, in which 5,500 people were murdered. Initially, these provocations and atrocities were stoically ignored. Eventually, Hitler was compelled to employ military intervention in order to protect the Germans in Poland. On the 30th of August 1939, in an act of great statesmanship, Hitler again offered to the Polish government the Marienwerder proposals. The 4 main proposals were as follows. 1. Retention of the existing 1919 borders as determined by the Treaty of Versailles. 2. The return of Danzig, population 370,000, to Germany, which was 97% German. 3. Construction of a 60-mile, 96-kilometer, autobahn and rail link connecting West and East Prussia, from Schönlanke to Marienwerder. 4. An exchange of German and Polish populations. On the orders of the international bankers, the British Foreign Secretary, Lord Edward Wood Halifax, strongly advised the Polish government not to negotiate. This is how and why World War II was started and disposes of the canard of German culpability. From 1939 onwards, although Germany made at least 28 known attempts at peace without conditions, they were all refused. The ensuing forced war resulted in victory for the international financiers and defeat and slavery for the people of Europe and indeed the world. In Europe, this enslavement was finally achieved with the establishment of the Rothschild-controlled European Central Bank on the 1st of June, 1998, and the introduction of the euro on the 1st of January, 1999. Achievements of the German state banking system. One of the primary benefits which state banking and monetary reform conferred on the German people was the provision of adequate housing. During the period 1933 to 1937, 1,458,178 new houses were built to the highest standards of the time. Each house could not be more than 2 stories high and had to have a garden. The building of apartments was discouraged, and rental payments on housing were not permitted to exceed 25 Reichsmarks per month, or 1/8 of the income of an average worker. Employees earning higher incomes paid a maximum of 45 Reichsmarks per month. Interest-free loans of 1,000 Reichsmarks, about 5 months of gross pay, known as Ehestandarlehen, marriage loans, were paid in certificates to newlywed couples to finance the purchase of household goods. The loan was repayable at 1% per month, but for each child born, 25% of the loan was cancelled. Thus, if a family had 4 children, the loan would have been considered repaid in full. The same principle was applied in respect of home loans, which were issued for a period of 10 years at a low rate of interest. The birth of each child also resulted in cancellation of 25% of the loan. Education in schools, technical colleges, and universities was free, while the universal health care system provided everyone with free medical care. During the period 1933 to 1937, imports increased by 31%, from 4.2 billion Reichsmarks to 5.5 billion Reichsmarks, while exports, particularly to Southeast Europe, rose by 20.4%, from 4.9 billion Reichsmarks to 5.9 billion Reichsmarks. This increased trade is reflected in the 76.9% rise in inland shipping, from 73.5 to 130 million tons conveyed, and the 69.4% rise in ocean shipping, from 36 million to 61 million tons transported. During this period, trade was greatly enhanced by barter, which bypassed the international payment system and the requirement of having to pay commission and interest on bills of exchange. By the late 1930s, 50% of all foreign trade was being conducted by means of barter transactions using offset accounting. There were 25 countries, mainly located in the Balkans and Latin America, participating in such barter agreements. In the same period, expenditure on roads, and in particular the Reichsautobahn, of which 2,400 miles, 3,862 kilometers, were completed by September 1939, rose by 229.5%, from 440 million Reichsmarks to 1.45 billion Reichsmarks. This construction, which besides having symbolic value representative of the new Germany, was necessary in order to accommodate the substantial increase in licensed vehicles, which rose by 425%, from 41,000 to 216,000 vehicles, and the even higher increase of 622% in licensed commercial vehicles, from 7,000 to 50,600. Between 1932 and 1938, iron ore production increased by 45.4%, from 843,000 to 1,226,000 tons. German ores contained only 25% iron, as opposed to the superior iron content of the Swedish ores, which they could not afford. This difficulty was overcome with the Krupp-Brenn process, which produced high-quality steel. Between 1932 and June 1939, the index of coal production rose by 85.5%, from 69 to 128, while the energy index rose during the same period by 76%, from 75 to 132. As a result of all this heightened and ever-increasing economic activity, unemployment, which stood at 30.1% in 1933, had been reduced to almost zero by July 1939, and retired workers had to be enticed back to the labor market in order to make up for the shortage of skilled workers. In contrast, the unemployment rate in the United States, which had stood at 25.1% in 1933, had, according to the National Industrial Conference Board, declined only marginally to 19.8% by January 1940, a situation which may be attributed to the irrational but nonetheless deliberate policies of the Rothschild-controlled Federal Reserve Bank and the parasitic private banking sector. National income in Germany rose by 43.8% from 45.2 billion Reichsmarks to 65 billion Reichsmarks between 1932 to 1937, while between 1932 and June 1939, the index of producer goods increased by 219.6%, from 46 to 147. Yet, the cost of living advanced by only 4%, or less than 1% per annum, a rate which would be achieved throughout the 12 years of state banking under National Socialism. The German monetary policy was non-inflationary because government expenditures, which increased the level of consumer demand, could in turn elicit a correspondingly increased quantity of disposable consumer goods. By 1939, Germany had become the most powerful country in the history of Europe. Its gross domestic product at an annual average growth rate of 11% per annum had doubled in the short space of 6 years of quasi-state banking. The Germans were now the happiest and most prosperous people in the world, fully employed and enjoying one of the highest standards of living. This success was achieved by the hard work of the German people and with the support of an honest money system not based on usury or the gold standard. One of the myths propagated by establishment historians is that Germany's economic renaissance was based on armaments production. The following table reveals modest levels of defense expenditure, which only picked up in 1938 to 1939 when Germany started to feel threatened by her neighbors. Even expenditure of 22% of national income on defense just before World War II started may be deemed as not being too excessive when one bears in mind that Germany's borders possess few natural boundaries, and at that time she was surrounded by hostile neighbors, Czechoslovakia, France, and Poland. Germany also had to replenish the armaments which she had been forbidden to possess in terms of the Treaty of Versailles. The English historian A.J.P. Taylor writes that the state of German armament in 1939 gives the decisive proof that Hitler was not contemplating general war, and probably not intending war at all. Post-World War II developments. In May 1945, the Deutsche Reichsbank ceased operations, although its affairs were only wrapped up in 1961, and was succeeded in the western half of the country by the Bank Deutscher Länder, Bank of German States, on the 1st of March 1948. This bank introduced the Deutsche Mark on the 21st of June 1948 and later became known as the Deutsche Bundesbank, which was established on the 26th of July 1957. Although legally independent and modeled on the U.S. Federal Reserve Bank, the Bundestag, or federal parliament, exerted considerable control and influence over its policies, and it was not as fully independent during that time as most central banks are today. During 2001, as a result of its membership of the European Central Bank, the Deutsche Bundesbank ceded most of its authority to that organization. Its remaining responsibilities, which are shared with the ECB, are the issuing of banknotes, managing the clearinghouse, bank supervision, and management of currency reserves. The principal objective of the ECB, as laid down in Article 127(1) of the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union, is to maintain price stability. This obsession is largely responsible for the record levels of unemployment and low levels of growth in GDP currently being experienced and the ongoing collapse in the birth rate. The ECB was established on the 1st of January 1998 and formally became operational on the 1st of January 1999 with the introduction of the euro. This Rothschild-controlled bank is ironically situated at Kaiserstrasse 29, Frankfurt am Main, not too far from the Judengasse, Jews Lane, where Mayor Amschel Rothschild and his brother Kalman set up a shop peddling coins and medals in the 1780s. For those 18 countries which have foolishly adopted the euro and joined the ECB, their subjugation and enslavement are a fait accompli. Fascist Italy. On the 28th of October, 1922, Benito Mussolini and his National Fascist Party came to power. Fascism should be more appropriately described as corporatism, as it symbolized a merger of state and corporate power. In 1936, the Chamber of Deputies was replaced by a National Council of Corporations with 823 representatives from industry, labor, and the states, who guided industry and settled labor disputes. In the 1920s, by means of deficit spending, a program of public works was instituted, which was unrivaled in modern Europe at that time. Bridges, canals, autostrada of 2,485 miles, 4,000 kilometers, hospitals, schools, railway stations, and orphanages were built. Forests were planted and universities were endowed. The Pontine marshes were drained, and 310 square miles, 802 square kilometers, were reclaimed. As part of the program of national self-sufficiency, or autarky, agriculture was subsidized and regulated. The State Bank of Italy. In 1926, Mussolini first intervened in the banking sector by granting the Banca d'Italia jurisdiction over the issue of banknotes and the management of minimum requirements for bank reserves, including gold. This formed part of his policy of using Italian fascism, primarily to create an autarkic state not subject to the vagaries of world trade and finance. In 1927, Italy received a loan from J.P. Morgan of $100 million to meet a special emergency. Thereafter, Mussolini refused to negotiate or accept any more foreign loans, as he was determined to keep Italy free from financial subservience to foreign banking interests. In 1931, the state arrogated to itself the right to supervise all major banks by means of the Istituto Mobiliare Italiano, Institute of Italian Securities. In 1936, the process was completed when, by means of the Atto Riforma Bancaria Banking Reform Act, the Banca d'Italia and the major banks became state institutions. The Banca d'Italia was now a fully fledged state bank, which had the sole right to create credit out of nothing and advance it for a nominal fee to other banks. Limits on state banking were lifted, as was the case with the Bank of Japan, see Infra, and Italy abandoned the gold standard. The State Bank of Japan. The Bank of Japan, or Nippon Ginko, was founded on the 10th of October, 1882. Although the Japanese imperial household was the largest shareholder, it functioned as a typical central bank, i.e., for the benefit of private banks to the detriment of public interest. In 1929, C.H. Douglas, whose system of social credit had been previously discussed, went on a lecture tour of Japan. His proposals for allowing government to create the nation's money in credit free of interest were enthusiastically received by the leaders of both the Japanese government and industry. All of Douglas's books and pamphlets were translated into Japanese, and more copies were sold in that country than in the rest of the world. The reorganization of the Bank of Japan into a state bank administered exclusively for the accomplishment of national interests was commenced in 1932. The reform of the bank was completed in 1942, when the Bank of Japan law was remodeled on Germany's Reichsbank Act of January 1939. The bank operated in the following manner. It declared that the bank was a special corporation of a strongly national nature. The bank was to assume the task of controlling currency and finance and supporting and promoting the credit system in conformity with policies of the state to ensure the full use of the nation's potential. Further, it was to be managed with the accomplishment of national aims as its sole guiding principle, Article 2. As for the functions of the bank, the law abolished the old principle of priority for commercial finance, empowering it to supervise facilities for industrial finance. The law also authorized the bank to make unlimited advances to the government without security, and to subscribe for and to absorb government bonds. In respect of note issues, the law made permanent the system of the maximum issues limit. Thus, the bank could make unlimited issues to meet the requirements of munitions industries and of the government. On the other hand, government supervision of the bank was markedly strengthened. The government could nominate, superintend, and give orders to the president and the directors. There was also a clause giving the government more comprehensive powers to give so-called functional orders to the bank, to direct it to perform any function it deems necessary for the attainment of the bank's purpose. Moreover, the law made a wide range of the bank's business subject to government approval, including such matters as the alteration of bank rate, note issues, and accounts. Japan had been experiencing the same traumatic difficulties caused by the artificially created Great Depression. However, the conversion from a central to a state banking methodology produced results which were both swift and sustained. The above table illustrates the progressive improvement which took place in the Japanese economy once the shackles of usury had been removed. During the 1931 to 1941 period, manufacturing output and industrial production increased by 140% and 136% respectively, while national income and the gross national product were up by 241% and 259% respectively. These remarkable increases exceeded by a wide margin the economic growth of the rest of the industrialized world. In the labor market, unemployment declined from 5.5% in 1930 to 3% in 1938. Industrial disputes decreased, with the number of stoppages down from 998 in 1931 to 159 in 1941. By the late 1930s, Japan had become the leading economic power in East Asia, and her exports were steadily replacing those of America and England. In August 1940, Japan announced the formation of the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere. The fear that these countries would adopt Japan's state banking methods posed such a serious threat to the Rothschild-owned and controlled U.S. Federal Reserve Bank that a war was deemed to be the only means of countering it. How Japan was forced into World War II. From July 1939, relations with America rapidly deteriorated after the USA unilaterally abrogated the Treaty of Commerce of 1911 and thereby restricted Japan's ability to import essential raw materials. These measures were imposed avowedly because of the war in China and were followed in June 1940 by an aviation fuel embargo and a ban on the export of iron and steel to Japan in November 1940. On the 25th of July, 1941, all Japanese assets in England, Holland, and America were frozen after Japan, with the permission of Vichy France, had peacefully occupied Indochina in order to block off China's southern supply routes, and all trade between Japan and America was summarily terminated. At the same time, President Franklin D. Roosevelt closed the Panama Canal to all Japanese shipping, and a rubber and oil embargo was enforced, which resulted in the latter case of the loss of 88% of all supplies. Without oil, Japan could not survive. General Hideki Tojo, Prime Minister, October 1941 to July 1944, explains in his diary how the United States continually thwarted Japanese efforts at maintaining peace. Japan's peaceful commercial relations were being persistently undermined by the USA and posed a grave threat to her future existence. By means of the economic blockade, a noose was being placed around Japan's neck. Not only were the United States, England, China, and Holland encircling Japan through economic pressures, but naval forces throughout the region in the Philippines, Singapore, and Malaya were being redeployed and strengthened. American battleships were observed steaming through the seas surrounding Japan. An American admiral claimed that the Japanese fleet could be sunk in a couple of weeks, while British Prime Minister Churchill declared that England would join America's side within 24 hours. General Tojo wrote, "Japan attempted to circumvent these dangerous circumstances by diplomatic negotiation, and although Japan heaped concession upon concession in the hope of finding a solution through mutual compromise, there was no progress because the United States would not retreat from its original position. Finally, in the end, the United States repeated demands that, under the circumstances, Japan could not accept: complete withdrawal of troops from China, repudiation of the Nanking government, withdrawal from the Tripartite Act." Numerous diplomatic initiatives were made by Japan, including the offer of a summit on the 8th of August 1941, but they all failed. By the 2nd of December 1941, Japan had been cut off from 75% of her normal trade by the Allied blockade, and thus found herself forced into attacking America in order to maintain her prosperity and to secure her existence as a sovereign nation. The uncompromising and unrelenting pressure applied by the usurers in New York had deliberately provoked Japan into taking retaliatory action. Post-World War II developments. Following Japan's defeat, one of the first acts of the United States occupation forces in Japan in September 1945 was to restructure the Japanese banking system, so as to make it compliant with the norms of the international bankers, i.e. usury. The unrestricted financing of the state by the Bank of Japan was abolished, and the large industrial combines, the zaibatsu, were dismantled. This policy was carried out by Joseph Dodge, a Detroit banker, who was financial advisor to the Supreme Allied Commander, General Douglas MacArthur. The Ministry of Finance was, however, able to retain a measure of control over the banking system, and in particular, monetary policy. In 1988, Japan was adversely affected by its compliance with the Basel I regulations, which obliged the Bank of Japan to raise the minimum capital requirements of its risk-related assets from 2% to 8%. This action precipitated an on-off recession which has lasted for the past 29 years. In April 1998, the Ministry of Finance was forced by law to yield to the independent Bank of Japan. Since that time, the Bank of Japan has functioned as a typical Rothschild-controlled central bank, which seldom performs its duties in the best interests of the Japanese people. A History of Central Banking and the Enslavement of Mankind, by Stephen Mitford Goodson. Chapter 7. Modern Forms of State Banking. Banking was conceived in iniquity and was born in sin. The bankers own the earth. Take it away from them, but leave them the power to create deposits, and with a flick of the pen, they will create enough deposits to buy it back again. However, take it away from them, and all the great fortunes like mine will disappear, and they ought to disappear, for this would be a happier and better world to live in. But if you wish to remain the slaves of the bankers and pay the cost of your own slavery, let them continue to create deposits. Sir Josiah Stamp, former director of the Bank of England. Bank of North Dakota. In 1919, the 48 states of the United States were offered the opportunity of setting up their own state banks. North Dakota was the only state which accepted this offer. North Dakota, capital Bismarck, has a population of 790,000. It is situated in the middle of America on the Canadian border. Notwithstanding its harsh winters, its primary source of both direct and indirect income is agriculture. It ranks first in the United States in the production of wheat, mainly durum, barley, canola, flaxseed, oats, and sunflower seeds. Shale oil obtained by fracking in the Bakken Basin and lignite are the state's principal mining products. Most of the states of America are technically insolvent, and with the exception of North Dakota and her western neighbor Montana, all have been experiencing budget deficits. By way of comparison, California, the largest state in economic terms and currently the world's 12th largest economy, had a deficit of just under $23 billion in April 2013 and pays out $10.4 billion in interest annually. In 2012, its bond debt amounted to $167.9 billion. In contrast to the other 49 states, which have been suffering rising levels of unemployment, North Dakota's unemployment rate has decreased and is currently the lowest in the USA at 2.7%. It also has the lowest default rates in the country. In September 2012, North Dakota had a budget surplus of $1.6 billion. Between 1997 and 2010, its GDP grew by 93.4%, from $16 billion to $31 billion. During the period from 2000 to 2011, personal income per capita increased by 127%, from $20,155 to $45,747, while the national increase was 37.4% over the same period. The secret of its success lies in its state bank. The mission statement of the bank is to provide sound financial services that promote agriculture, commerce, and industry. By law, the state must deposit all its funds in the bank, which pays a competitive rate of interest to the state treasurer. The bank pays over all its profits to the state, which in 2011 were $60 million. Over $450 million has been paid to the state in the past 11 years. Most of these funds are used to offset taxes. The bank also provides a secondary market for real estate loans, guarantees for new business ventures, and loans for farmers at an interest rate of 1% per annum. There has been no credit crisis or credit freeze in North Dakota, as the bank provides the state's own credit. By having established its own economic sovereignty, North Dakota has become the most financially viable and prosperous state in the USA. In 2015, the North Dakota Legislative Assembly established a Bank of North Dakota Infrastructure Loan Fund program, which made $50 million in funds available to communities with a population of less than 2,000 and $100 million available to communities with a population greater than 2,000. These loans have a 2% fixed interest rate of return and a term of up to 30 years. The proceeds can be used for the new construction of water and treatment plants, sewer and water lines, transportation infrastructure, and other similar needs to support new growth in a community. While state banking will not resolve the financial impasse being experienced at national level, state banks in the USA have the potential to provide considerable relief at state government level: budget surpluses, lower taxes, less unemployment, and higher levels of prosperity. As of December 2016, there were 25 states considering some form of state banking legislation. The States of Guernsey. In 1815, after the Napoleonic Wars had ended, Guernsey was in a precarious state. Its roads were in disrepair, the dikes were collapsing, and the economy had slumped. The island was unable to borrow money as it could not raise the taxes to pay the required interest. In 1816, in order to fund public works and a new marketplace, the Committee of the States of Guernsey devised a novel solution. It issued £6,000 in £1 notes, free of debt and interest. Within 2 years, all the works had been completed without any addition to the state debt. A further £5,000, some of them in denominations of £5 notes, were authorized in 1824 to rebuild the Elizabeth College, founded by Queen Elizabeth I in 1563, and parochial schools. By 1837, £55,000 were in circulation. The island experienced increased trade and tourism and levels of prosperity not previously seen. In 1914, the state's notes issued had increased to £142,000. In 1937, the figure was £175,000. The cost of printing these notes was £450, compared to an annual interest charge of £11,383 per annum, 6.5%. By 1958, there were £542,765 in existence. Currently, there are £43.8 million in circulation. Today, Guernsey has a population of 65,400, which enjoys one of the highest standards of living in the world. There is a flat income tax rate of 20% on worldwide income capped at £220,000 per annum. There is no company tax except for a 10% tax on certain banking activities, no capital gains tax, no inheritance tax or estate duty, no purchase or sales tax, no value-added tax, VAT, and no capital transfer tax. Guernsey has neither a national debt nor any external debt. Central Bank of Libya. From 1551 to 1911, Libya was ruled by the Ottoman Empire, by Italy from 1911 to 1943, and from 1943 to 1951 was under the military suzerainty of Britain and France. The Central Bank of Libya was founded in 1956 and was run as a typical central bank until the bloodless coup d'etat of the 1st of September 1969. Oil of an exceptionally high quality was discovered in 1959. However, King Idris al-Mahdi as-Sanusi failed to capitalize on this bonanza or use it for the benefit of his people, and the bulk of the oil profits were siphoned into the coffers of the oil companies. On assuming power in 1969, Muammar Mohammed al-Gaddafi took control of most of the economic activities in the country, including the central bank, which for all practical purposes was run as a state bank. It operated as a banker of the local bankers, and foreign bankers were not permitted to operate. Financing of government infrastructure did not attract riba, interest, and Libya had no national debt and no foreign debt. Its foreign exchange reserves exceeded $54 billion, which may be compared to reserves of developed countries such as the United Kingdom and Canada, which in 2010 were $50 billion and $40 billion respectively. GDP growth during the period 2000 to 2010 was 4.32% per annum, and the official figure for inflation was minus 0.27%. Colonel Gaddafi was described by the mainstream media as being a terrible dictator and a blood-sucking monster. But the reality was that with the exception of the city of Benghazi and its environs, he had the support of 90% of the population. The following benefits provided by Gaddafi explain why he was so popular. Free education. Students were paid the average salary for which subjects they were studying. Students studying overseas were provided with accommodation, an automobile, and €2,500 per annum. Free electricity. Free healthcare. Free housing. There were no mortgages. Newlywed couples received a gift of 60,000 dinar, $50,000, from government. Automobiles were sold at factory cost free of interest. Private loans were provided free of interest. Bread cost 15 US cents per loaf. Gasoline cost 12 US cents per liter. Portion of profits from sale of oil was paid directly into bank accounts of citizens. Farmers received free land, seeds, and animals. Full employment with those temporarily unemployed paid a full salary as if employed. Gaddafi's Jamahiriya, state of the masses, ensured that the wealth of this country of 5.79 million inhabitants was fairly distributed to all its people. Beggars and homeless vagrants did not exist, while life expectancy at 75 years was the highest in Africa and 10% above the world average. The literacy rate was 82%. Regarding human rights, Libya stood at 61 in the International Incarceration Index. The lower the rating, the lower the standing. The number 1 spot is currently occupied by the United States. Another major achievement which Gaddafi initiated was the conversion of the Nubian sandstone fossil aquifer system into the Great Man-Made River, which supplies 6.5 million cubic meters of fresh water daily to the cities of Tripoli, Sirte, and Benghazi. The extracted water is 10 times cheaper than desalinated water. The total cost of the project, estimated at $25 billion, was financed without a single foreign loan. Although the central banks of Belarus, Burma, Cuba, Iran, North Korea, North Sudan, and Syria do not fall under the direct control of the Rothschild banking syndicate, Libya had the only central bank run on genuine state banking lines, which exhibited the classic symptoms of full employment, zero inflation, and a modern-day workers' paradise. The question arises as to why NATO intervened on the pretext of fabricated human rights abuses, the so-called responsibility to protect. Since 1971, when the United States abandoned the gold exchange standard for the petrodollar with the connivance of Saudi Arabia, any attempt to displace the United States dollar as the premier reserve currency has been blocked and opposed with violence. In November 2000, Saddam Hussein of Iraq decreed that all oil payments would in future be made in euros, as he did not wish to deal in the currency of the enemy. As has already been proven, the possession of weapons of mass destruction pretext was a deliberately concocted hoax, and it was this currency decision which cost Saddam Hussein his life and the destruction of his country. In similar circumstances, Gaddafi announced in 2010 the creation of the gold dinar as a replacement for the settlement of all foreign transactions in a proposed region of over 200 million people. Libya at that time possessed 144 tons of gold. What was intended was not a return to the gold standard per se, but a new unit of account with oil exports and other resources being paid for in gold dinars. Gaddafi crossed a red line and paid the ultimate price. Since 2007, Iran has stipulated that payments be made in euro currency. On the 17th of February 2008, the Iranian oil bourse for trading in petroleum, petrochemicals, and gas using primarily the euro, Iranian rial, and a basket of non-U.S. currencies was established. The first oil shipments under the new system were sold through this market in July 2011. This event must be deemed as one of the prime causes for the constant Israeli and American threats to annihilate Iran. A History of Central Banking and the Enslavement of Mankind by Stephen Mitford Goodson. Chapter 8. The Banking Crisis. I'm afraid that the ordinary citizen will not like to be told that the banks can, and do, create and destroy money. The amount of money in existence varies only with the actions of the banks increasing and decreasing deposits and bank purchases. And they who control the credit of a nation direct the policy of governments and hold in the hollow of their hands the destiny of the people. Reginald McKenna, former Chancellor of the Exchequer. Historical overview. Banking crises generally take three forms. 1. Where an individual bank collapses because of a lack of confidence and a subsequent withdrawal of deposits. 2. A bank run when a number of banks fail simultaneously. And 3. When the entire system implodes. In the 18th century, banking crises were confined to only those countries which had central banks and practiced usury, viz., England, the Netherlands, and Sweden. In 1710, the Sword Blade Bank, in competition with the Bank of England, took over a portion of the national debt in exchange for Sword Blade shares. The following year, the South Sea Company did a similar deal and in 1720 took over the remaining government debt in exchange for its overvalued shares. The South Sea Company was nothing but a shell and had no trading assets. On the 24th of September, 1720, the Sword Blade Bank went into liquidation, and by the end of that year, the shares of the South Sea Company had lost almost 90% of their peak value of £1,000 per share. In 1763, after the end of the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, vissels, or bills, issued by Dutch banker Lindert Peter de Neufville could not be redeemed and precipitated a run on banks in the Netherlands, Germany, and Sweden. On the 10th of June, 1772, the London banking houses of Neal, James, Fordyce, and Down, which had been indulging in speculation on a massive scale by shorting East India Company stock, crashed after it could no longer cover its losses by raiding customers' deposits. 22 significant banks and almost all private banks in Scotland were forced into liquidation. The contagion then spread to Amsterdam. Many banks there experienced a liquidity crisis, including Clifford & Sons, which went bankrupt. Henceforth, almost all banking crises would be precipitated as a result of the central banking model, which permits private banks to create money as an interest-bearing debt and then destroy it once it has been repaid. Thus, the first two panics in the United States in 1792 and 1796 to 1797 were induced by the First Bank of the United States when it purposefully withheld credit in order to cause a slump. A similar financial disaster and subsequent depression were planned and executed by the Rothschild-owned Second Bank of the United States in 1819, while England was also afflicted by artificially created panics in 1825 and 1847. In the Panic of 1825, 66 banks were forced to close their doors. There was another banking panic in the United States in 1857 as a result of a fabricated shortage of gold and the failure of the Ohio Life Insurance and Trust Company. As has already been observed in Chapter 4, once the United States was forced onto the gold standard in January 1873, a pattern of more frequent and intensified banking panics evolved. Less than 8 months later, in September of that year, the United States was premeditatedly plunged into a recession which lasted for 4 years. The ensuing panics of 1884, 1890, 1890-91, 1893-94, 1897, 1903, and 1907 were all deliberately orchestrated so as to drive the American people into a state of confusion and despair. After 40 years of planned chaos, of boom and bust, as well as a targeted media campaign of disinformation, the population meekly capitulated and the banking conspirators' dream of a United States central bank was realized on the 23rd of December, 1913. After the Great Depression, which had been contrived by the U.S. Federal Reserve Bank, a relative period of stability supervened until the 1990s, when an ever-increasing number of countries suffered economic crises and financial difficulties. Finland, Sweden, Venezuela, Indonesia, South Korea, Thailand, Russia, Argentina, Ecuador, and Uruguay. The banking crisis, 2007 and onward. The seeds of the current banking crisis were sown when the Glass-Steagall Act of 1933, which prohibited bank holding companies from owning financial institutions and separated banks from investment houses, was abrogated on the 12th of November, 1999. At the time of the promulgation of the original act, Senator Carter Glass, a former U.S. Secretary of the Treasury and one of its authors, remarked that, "With a gun, a man can rob a bank. With a bank, a man can rob the world." It was deemed towards the end of President Clinton's administration that everyone had the right to own a home, and for this purpose, the Department of Housing and Development initiated a program called National Homeownership Strategy Partners in the American Dream. In order to attract as many new homeowners as possible, credit standards and regulations were relaxed, and government allowed borrowers a tax credit of $8,000. Low teaser interest rates were offered for the first 2 years, but with substantially higher rates being payable thereafter. Between 1998 and 2006, house prices rose by 124%, but 2 years later, in 2008, a drop of 20% was recorded. In contrast to rising prices, the affordability of housing showed a declining trend. Between 1980 to 2000, the ratio of the cost of an average house to median household income was 3.0, but by 2006, it had risen to 4.6. Credit default swaps, which were intended to hedge or speculate against credit risks, increased hundredfold between 1998 and 2008 to $47 trillion and had a notional value of $683 trillion. In order to fuel the property boom, innovative financial products were developed, such as collateralized debt obligations. Mortgages of varying degrees of quality were bundled up and, after having been assessed, fraudulently as it transpired by rating agencies as being AAA in many cases, were sold on to gullible investors. In order to further this culture of greed, the shadow banking sector, which includes investment banks and hedge funds, and whose total funds were believed at that time to have amounted to in excess of $100 trillion, aggressively marketed these products, notwithstanding the fact that by June 2007, 39% of all home loans did not meet the underwriting standards of any issuer. The balloon finally went up when Lehman Brothers was declared bankrupt on the 15th of September 2008. A rescue package was hastily assembled and Congress approved a sum of $700 billion for a Troubled Asset Relief Program, TARP. But this was only the tip of the iceberg, as the U.S. Federal Reserve Bank has since granted over $16 trillion worth of assistance to domestic and foreign banks. According to the memoir of Neil Barofsky, Inspector General of the TARP, the final figure may well exceed $24 trillion. It therefore comes as no surprise that, during the period 2008 to 2013, the U.S. Federal Reserve Bank has expanded its balance sheet by 500% to $5 trillion in order to prop up an insolvent banking sector with its Ponzi-like quantitative easing program. While in similar vein, between 2007 and 2012, the balance sheets of the 6 largest Western banks have been inflated by 36.4%, from $10.7 trillion to $14.6 trillion. Causatum. In the aftermath of this financial crisis, attempts have been made to remedy what is in essence an insoluble problem. The Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act, passed into law on the 21st of July 2010, contains numerous regulations designed to promote accountability, financial stability, and transparency. 200 pages of the Act are devoted to mortgage reform and include higher underwriting standards and an obligation on mortgage originators to ensure that borrowers have the ability to repay their loans. The sciolists of the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision have proposed higher levels of capital and liquidity ratios in the hope that these measures will strengthen the banking sector. Regrettably, they will in all probability have the opposite outcome and will only cause the money supply to shrink further and thereby deepen the recession. What is not understood by most bankers and economists is that the only method available for keeping the economy running is to sink further into debt at interest, as debt-based money is the only source of our means of exchange. Hence, the persistent mantra that growth must be maintained at all costs, because if all loans were to be repaid, the money supply would vanish, and we would be reduced to exchanging goods and services with banknotes and barter. In the current situation, a worldwide debt cancellation would therefore not be out of place if the money supply could be replaced by state bank-created, interest-free, and debt-free money. The underlying reason why the developed world, which has in the past produced superior, long-lasting products, has been partially deindustrialized is so that inferior goods have to be continually produced by third-world countries in order to fuel the growth syndrome. It also highlights the absurdity of the insistence that Europe needs economic growth when its indigenous population is shrinking. This policy of deliberately planned obsolescence and forced growth also has very deleterious effects on the environment. As will be observed in the final section, the collapse in female fertility rates in the developed world, which is a direct consequence of usury, will lead to the extinction of civilization. In conclusion, it may be stated that the principal hidden purpose of the banking crisis is to generate a general feeling of desperation and an acclamation for a solution such as a world central bank. a similar situation which prevailed in the United States during the late 19th century when banking panics were being artificially created in preparation for the imposition of the U.S. Federal Reserve Bank. Whether the parasitic bankers will achieve this objective is open to doubt, as the host may well have vanished by then. The Great Depression of the 21st century. One of the primary causes of the ballooning debt bubble has been the suicidal policy of globalization and free trade, which has resulted in the aforementioned partial deindustrialization of the United States, United Kingdom, and Europe. The relocation of industries to third world countries has precipitated a reduction in the manufacturing base of the developed world, structural unemployment of a permanent nature, and a widening trade gap. In an attempt to maintain their falling standards of living, consumers in these affected countries have been forced to take on increasing levels of personal debt. Thus, in the United States, during the 1980s, $2.37 of private debt was required to produce $1 of growth in GDP. In the 1990s, the figure rose to $2.99, and in the 2000s, there was a dramatic increase to $5.67 for each incremental dollar of economic growth, a level which will soon become untenable. A further aggravating factor is that the rising cost of extracting energy, also known as the Energy Returns on Energy Invested, EROEI, is rapidly approaching a tipping point. According to a Tullett-Prebon report, in 1990, the theoretical cost of energy would have been 2.43% of GDP, and in 2010, it almost doubled to 4.7% of GDP. It is predicted to rise to 9.6% of GDP by 2020 and to 15% by 2030. This decline in energy returns, which will cause the widespread closure of mines and industries and adversely affect agriculture, predicates a very substantial drop in living standards. Escalating extraction costs of energy are not the only predicament facing mankind. During the past 100 years, water consumption has quadrupled and continues to rise. Currently, 1.6 billion people are facing absolute water scarcity, and, according to a recent U.S. government report in June 2014, global demand for water will exceed supply by 40% by 2030. However, the factor which overrides all these macroeconomic considerations is the collapse in the birth rate of the developed world. At the turn of the 20th century, the white population of the world numbered 590 million, or 36% of its 1.65 billion total. In 2016, although that number had increased absolutely to 1 billion, its relative share of the world's population of 7.5 billion has shrunk to 13.3%. Two fratricidal and pointless world wars over the maintenance of the usury system set this catastrophic decline in motion. The following table of fertility rates reveals the inevitability and the near mathematical certainty that, by 2100, most of the whites and a large portion of the Asian peoples of Northeast Asia will have died out. The first column of the table of fertility rates above lists all countries with a population in excess of 100 million, while the following table lists the populations of the major white and Far East Asian countries. The accepted fertility rate for the replacement of a population is 2.11. Thus, the white, Chinese, and Japanese populations will be severely depleted within 3 generations, and, unless the fertility rate substantially increases, will face eventual extinction. From the above table, it may be noted that a fertility rate of 1.3 would take 80 to 100 years to reverse, which is well nigh impossible, while historically, a fertility rate of 1.9 has never been reversed. Moreover, the sharpness of the decline in the white population is concealed by virtue of the fact that large numbers of non-whites, who have much higher rates of fertility, are included in these fertility rates. The percentage of whites in the following major countries is as follows: Brazil, 48, Germany, 88, United Kingdom, 86, Australia, 85, France, 85, Russia, 81, Canada, 80, United States, 65. Much reliance has been placed on China, which it is hoped will save the world economy from its demise, but the fertility rates of neighboring territories of Hong Kong, population 7 million, of 0.97, and Taiwan, population 23.3 million, of 1.1, are indicative of a declining trend, and are matched by mainland China's fertility rate of 1.05. These declining fertility rates in China are also underpinned by the one-child policy of the Chinese government, which has been in effect since 1979. It is anticipated that China will achieve zero population growth in the near future. Since World War II, ever-increasing numbers of married women in the Western world, deluded by the malevolent propaganda of feminism and gender equality, have been forced to seek employment so that their families can pay the ever-increasing amount of interest necessary in order to make ends meet. Most of this interest is accrued on mortgage loans, i.e., on money which banks have created out of nothing. The direct result of this iniquitous financial system has been the undermining of a normal family life and a dramatic reduction in female fertility. According to Aaron Russo, the Rockefellers were behind this diabolical scheme, which was created to draw women into the income tax net, place their children in school at an early age where they could be indoctrinated, destabilize society, and set up the New World Order. In this manner, the link between usury and demographic decline has been established. Even if the usury system should be abolished in its entirety within the next 5 to 10 years, these trends will not be easily reversed over both the short and medium term. If usury remains intact, then the world must brace itself for a depression similar to the Dark Ages, which will last for many centuries. In the preceding chapters, it has been proven conclusively that state banking and the sovereign issue of a nation's money supply are the only means for the provision of a natural order of harmony, peace, and prosperity founded on the ethnic independence of all peoples. The past 300 years, notwithstanding numerous technological advancements, have witnessed a progressive deterioration in Western and European standards of civilization. The excessive concentration of power and wealth, based exclusively on dishonest banking methods, has enabled a tiny minority of criminal bankers to control the media and educational processes, and thereby to brainwash a mindless and atomized humanity, deluded by the spurious comforts of democracy and materialism into suicidal practices of savage, bloody, and pointless wars, central banking, and cultural degradation, which will eventually result in its demographic extinction.